From the god king NARAM-SIN watching mighty AKKAD crumble to ATAHUALPA trading a room of gold for unexpected chains, this is a calm yet gripping journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with how one proud title drew famine and Gutian raiders, and move deeper into why piles of shining treasure could not shield an Inca throne. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. NARAM-SIN of AKKAD. In the bronze-tinted twilight of the 3rd millennium before Christ, when the world was young and empires were but dreams whispered between river reeds, there stood a city that would teach humanity its first lessons in imperial hubris. AKKAD rose from the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia like a fever dream made manifest, its ziggurats catching the last amber light of day as merchants counted silver and scribes pressed their wedge-shaped thoughts into clay. This was the world's first empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the cedar forests of Lebanon, from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean's edge. Sargon the Great had built it with bronze and blood, his armies flowing like spring floods across the fertile crescent. But empires, like men, must pass their crowns to sons, and sons to grandsons, and with each passing, something essential bleeds away into the sand. NARAM-SIN inherited this vast realm in 254 BCE, when he was barely more than a boy with ambitious eyes and a grandfather's ghost whispering in his ear. The cuneiform tablets tell us he was blessed with military genius, this young king who would learn too late that some victories cost more than defeats. His armies moved like shadows across the ancient world, conquering the Elamites in their mountain fastnesses, reducing the proud cities of Syria to smoldering tribute, pushing north into Anatolia, where the Hittites would later rise. With each triumph, the courtiers bowed lower, their foreheads touching floors of polished stone. The priests offered longer prayers, their voices echoing through temple halls thick with incense and possibility. And somewhere in those endless choruses of praise, in the rhythmic chanting of his victories, NARAM-SIN began to believe what they were telling him. He was no ordinary king. He was beloved of the gods. He was chosen. He was different. The first whispers of divinity came soft as silk, gentle as a lover's caress. Why should he merely rule by divine mandate when he could rule as divinity itself? The leap from earthly king to heavenly god seems vast to us now, but in those days when the boundary between mortal and divine was as thin as hammered gold, it felt almost inevitable. And so, in the 36th year of his reign, when the empire stretched wider than any realm before or since, NARAM-SIN did something that would echo through the centuries like a curse. He took for himself the title that no mortal had dared claim. King of the Four Quarters, God of AKKAD, the royal seal. Cutters carved it into stone, the scribes pressed it into clay, and the very gods themselves, the tablets tell us, began to turn their faces away. The omens started small, as divine displeasure often does. A solar eclipse darkened the sky above AKKAD, turning day to night in the space of a held breath. The palace astronomers consulted their charts, their faces grave as mourners. Such eclipses were messages from the heavens, they whispered, warnings written in shadow and starlight. But NARAM-SIN, drunk on his own godhood, dismissed their fears with a wave of his jeweled hand. If the gods wanted to test him, let them try. He was their equal now, perhaps their superior. Had he not conquered lands they had never touched? Had he not built cities that reached toward their very thrones? The eclipse was not a warning, it was an invitation. It was time to show the old gods who truly ruled the world. The temple of Ekur stood in the sacred city of Nippur, its ancient walls consecrated to Enlil. Lord of the wind and storm, father of the gods themselves. For 1,000 years, kings had come here to seek blessing, to offer tribute, to bow before powers greater than themselves. But NARAM-SIN came as a conqueror, his soldiers' bronze spears glinting in the temple's eternal flames. What happened next would be whispered about in Mesopotamian taverns for generations. The god king ordered his men to sack the holy place, to carry away its treasures like common bandits. Sacred vessels that had held the breath of gods were melted down for their gold. Statues carved by master craftsmen were dragged through the streets behind ox carts. The priests, those ancient guardians of divine mysteries, were scattered like leaves before a storm. But the greatest sacrilege was yet to come. In the temple's innermost sanctuary, where Enlil's presence was said to dwell in silence and shadow, NARAM-SIN raised his own image beside the gods. Two figures now shared the holy space: the ancient Lord of Storms and the mortal king who had declared himself divine. The very stone seemed to groan with the weight of such hubris. The consequences came swift as judgment, terrible as prophecy. The rains failed that year, and the year after, and the year after that. The great rivers that had nourished civilization since the dawn of time began to shrink, their waters turning bitter and strange. Crops withered in fields that had never known famine. Children cried in the streets of cities that had never known want. From the Zagros mountains came the Gutians, wild men with painted faces and bronze axes, flowing down from their rocky homeland like a plague of locusts. They had always been there, these mountain tribes, kept at bay by Akkadian strength and the empire's long reach. But now, as the cities weakened and the garrisons thinned, they pressed against the borders like water against a cracking dam. The vassal kings began to whisper among themselves, their loyalty crumbling like sun-dried brick. Why should they send tribute to a god who brought only drought? Why should they fear an empire that could not protect its own fields? One by one, they stopped sending their annual gifts. One by one, they began to look toward other protectors, other gods, other kings who might prove more worthy of their faith. NARAM-SIN fought against the tide with all the fury of a man who has glimpsed his own mortality. His armies marched and countermarched across the empire's fracturing borders, winning battles that no longer mattered, conquering cities that would rebel again before the year was out. Each victory felt hollow, each triumph tasted of ash. The god king began to understand, perhaps, that some crowns are too heavy for mortal heads. The Gutians came in waves, their war cries echoing across the plains like the voices of long-dead kings. They took the outlying cities first, then the provincial capitals, then the great centers of trade and learning. AKKAD itself held out for a time, its walls still strong, its defenders still loyal. But the empire was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, and even gods, it seemed, could bleed. In the end, it was not conquest that killed the world's first empire, but something far more subtle and far more final. The cities simply stopped. Stopped sending taxes, stopped acknowledging Akkadian authority, stopped believing in the dream that had once united the world under a single crown. The empire did not fall so much as fade, like a mirage dissolving in the desert heat. NARAM-SIN ruled for 37 years, and for 37 years he called himself a god. But gods, the people learned, are supposed to bring blessings, not curses. They are supposed to make the crops grow, not wither. They are supposed to protect their people, not lead them into darkness. And when a god fails in these most basic duties, what is left but to find new gods, new kings, new dreams to follow? The last tablets from AKKAD speak of a king grown old before his time, wandering the empty halls of his palace like a ghost haunting its own tomb. The courtiers had fled, the priests had found new temples, the soldiers had joined other armies. The god king was alone with his divinity, and divinity, it turned out, was cold company in the gathering dusk. The wind began to blow then, as it always does, when great things end. It carried sand from the desert, salt from the sea, and the whispers of future historians who would try to understand how the world's first empire had toppled itself. The sand piled against the walls of abandoned cities, crept through the windows of empty palaces, covered the roads that had once carried the commerce of nations. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, You could hear the laughter of older gods, the ones who had watched empires rise and fall since the world was young. They had seen this story before, and they would see it again. Kings would always reach too high, grasp too much, forget that they were merely human. The sands would shift, the winds would blow, and somewhere in the future, new kings would learn the same bitter lessons about the price of calling oneself divine. The empire of AKKAD crumbled to dust in the space of a generation, its god-king's name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in the courts of future empires. But the desert remembers everything, and sometimes, when the wind is right and the sun hangs low in the western sky, you can still hear the echo of bronze spears and the whisper of divine ambition turning to ash beneath the weight of its own presumption. G of Sia. The summer night hung heavy over the yellow river valley like silk draped across a sleeping giant's shoulders. Lotus blossoms floated on waters that reflected stars and palace lanterns in equal measure, their petals catching the warm breeze that carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of laughter from the imperial gardens. This was the world of Jie, last king of the Xia dynasty, and tonight, like so many nights before, he would feast while his empire slowly dissolved around him like sugar in wine. The wine pond stretched before the palace like a mirror made of fermented grain, its surface rippling gently in the evening air. Legend says it was large enough to row a boat across, deep enough to drown a man, and rich enough to intoxicate an army. Around its shores grew the meat forest, that fabled grove where whole roasted oxen hung from bronze hooks like strange fruit, where deer and wild boar dangled from chains of gold, where the very trees seemed to drip with honey and rendered fat. Jie reclined on his throne of carved jade, watching the reflections dance in the wine pond's depths. His courtiers moved like colorful fish through the gardens, their silk robes whispering secrets to the night air. Musicians played instruments of ivory and gold, their melodies floating across the water like prayers to forgotten gods. Dancers swayed between the hanging carcasses, their movements as graceful as reeds bending in the wind. But beyond the palace walls, beyond the reach of lantern light and laughter, a different kind of night was falling. The drought had lasted 3 years now, turning the fertile fields of the Yellow River Valley into cracked earth that crunched beneath farmers' feet like broken pottery. The peasants huddled in their mud brick houses, counting grains of millet like precious stones, watching their children grow thin as winter reeds. They had sent petitions to the palace, these forgotten people, their rough hands shaping characters on strips of bamboo with all the desperate hope of the drowning. They begged for grain from the royal storehouses, for relief from the crushing taxes that took what little their withered fields produced. But their words disappeared into the palace bureaucracy like drops of water in desert sand, and the wine pond continued to ripple with reflection and excess. The king himself seemed untouched by the suffering beyond his walls. He had been born to luxury, raised on delicacies and flattery, taught to believe that the mandate of heaven meant never having to consider the weight of responsibility. His days were spent in pleasure, his nights in revelry, his years in the slow, sweet dissolution of a man who had never learned that crowns come with costs. But in the flickering shadows beyond the meat forest, where the palace gardens met the outer courtyards, other eyes were watching. Tang, nobleman of the Shang, sat in a simple room lit by a single bronze lamp, his fingers moving across bamboo strips covered in careful calculations. Here were the tribute records of the outlying provinces, the reports of failed harvests, the whispered accounts of peasant uprisings in the distant mountains. Tang was a patient man, as patient as water wearing away stone. He had served in Jie's court for 7 years, bowing low when required, smiling when expected, all the while watching and waiting and learning. He saw how the king's attention wandered during council meetings, how his eyes glazed over when ministers spoke of trade routes and tax collections. He noticed which generals grew restless during their long waits for audiences, which provincial governors stopped sending their sons to court as hostages. The lamp flame guttered slightly, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Tang continued his quiet work. He was not plotting rebellion, not exactly. He was simply preparing for the moment when the dynasty's own weight would finally crack the foundations, when the wine pond would run dry and the meat forest would wither, when the mandate of heaven would pass to worthier hands. That moment came sooner than even Tang had expected. The 4th year of drought brought something more than empty bellies and dying crops. It brought rage, hot and sudden as a summer storm. The peasants rose in the south first, their crude weapons glinting in the harsh sunlight as they burned tax offices and drove off the king's collectors. The uprising spread like wildfire through the provinces, each success inspiring another, each victory proving that the royal armies were not invincible after all. Word reached the capital on a dust-covered messenger's lips, interrupting one of Ji's endless banquets. The king listened with the detached interest of a man hearing about events in a distant country, then waved dismissively for the music to continue. But Tang, standing quietly in the shadows, felt something shift in the air like the first breath of wind before a storm. The great battle came at Mingtiao, where the remnants of the Xia army made their final stand against Tang's disciplined forces. The ancient histories describe it as a clash of dynasties, but those who were there remembered it differently. It was not bronze against bronze, but hope against despair, competence against decay, the future against a past that had already died without realizing it. Ji fought bravely, they say, once he finally understood that his comfortable world was ending. But bravery cannot make up for years of neglect, and personal valor cannot compensate for systemic rot. His army melted away like morning mist, his generals surrendered with relief, and the king himself fled the battlefield with only a handful of loyal retainers. The flight to Nanchao was a journey through a kingdom transformed. The cities Jie had known as centers of wealth and culture now stood half empty, their granaries bare, their temples eerily quiet. The peasants who watched his bedraggled procession pass showed neither respect nor hatred, only the hollow-eyed indifference of people who had suffered too much to care about the fate of kings. At Nanchao, in a modest house that might once have served as a minor official's residence, the last king of the Xia dynasty lived out his remaining days. The wine pond existed now only in memory. The meat forest had become a children's tale, and the palace gardens had been transformed into practical rice fields under Tang's efficient administration. Ji spent his mornings staring at the mountains, his afternoons composing melancholy poems about the transience of power, his evenings drinking ordinary wine and remembering the taste of imperial excess. He died quietly, as failed kings often do, attended only by a few faithful servants and the weight of his own regrets. The historians would remember him as a cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of indulgence and the importance of good governance. But in the end, perhaps, he was simply a man who had inherited a crown too heavy for his shoulders and a world too complex for his understanding. The reeds grew back quickly, as reeds always do. They crept up through the cracked foundation stones of the abandoned palace, wound around the rotting posts of the wine pond's docks, reclaimed the carefully manicured gardens where the meat forest had once stood. Within a generation, travelers would pass through the area and see only marshland, only the gentle whisper of wind through tall grass, only the patient work of nature, healing the scars left by human ambition. And in that whisper, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of laughter from summer nights that would never come again, the ghost of music played on instruments of gold, the memory of a young king who had thought that pleasure was the same as happiness, that luxury was the same as strength, that the mandate of heaven was something that could be drunk from a wine pond, rather than earned through wisdom and care. The yellow river flowed on, indifferent to dynasties and their rise and fall, carrying the silt of ages toward the sea. And somewhere in that endless flow, the dreams of the Xia dynasty dissolved like salt in water, joining the countless other dreams that had thought themselves eternal and learned, too late. that nothing under heaven lasts forever. Di-Shin of Shang. The dear terrace palace rose above the yellow river like a fever dream carved from wood and stone, its terraced gardens ascending toward heaven in defiance of both gravity and good sense. In the gathering dusk of a dynasty's final years, when the sun hung low and red over the ancient kingdoms of China, King Di-Shin walked these elevated paths with the measured stride of a man who had mistaken cruelty for strength and isolation for power. The palace was Di-Shin's masterpiece, a monument to architectural ambition that scraped the bellies of clouds and challenged the very gods to notice its presumption. Each terrace told a story of excess, from the wine pools that reflected the stars to the gardens where exotic animals prowled in jeweled cages. But it was in the deeper chambers, in the rooms where screams echoed against walls of polished bronze, that the true character of the last Shang king revealed itself. The roasting log waited in the palace's heart like a sleeping demon, its bronze surface gleaming with the reflected light of carefully tended flames. Di-Shin had designed it himself, this instrument of exquisite torture, a hollow cylinder that could be heated to glowing while prisoners were forced to walk across its surface. The king would watch from his throne, his face serene as a temple statue, as men and women danced their final dance on burning metal. It was not mere sadism that drove these displays, though sadism certainly played its part. In Di-Shin's mind, such spectacles served a deeper purpose. They were demonstrations of power, reminders to his court that their king was not bound by the ordinary constraints of morality or mercy. When nobles whispered of rebellion, when generals grew too confident, when ministers forgot their place, the roasting log would glow red in the darkness, and the whispers would stop. But while Di-Shin perfected his theater of cruelty, the world beyond his palace walls was shifting like sand in an hourglass. To the west, in the valley of the Wei River, the Zhou people were sharpening their bronze swords and practicing the arts of war. Their king, Wu, spoke of the mandate of heaven with the fervor of a prophet, claiming that the gods themselves had grown disgusted with Shang rule and were ready to transfer their blessing to worthier hands. The omens came thick as autumn leaves, each one darker than the last. A solar eclipse darkened the sky above the capital, turning day to night in the space of a held breath. The palace astronomers consulted their charts with trembling hands, their faces grave as mourners. Such eclipses were messages from the heavens, they whispered, warnings written in shadow and starlight that kings ignored at their peril. But Di-Shin, drunk on his own terrible power, dismissed their fears with a wave of his jeweled hand. If the gods wanted to test him, let them try. He was their equal now, perhaps their superior. Had he not built a palace that reached toward their very thrones? Had he not demonstrated power over life and death itself? The eclipse was not a warning, it was acknowledgement of his divinity. The debates began in the palace's outer chambers, where court philosophers gathered like moths around the flame of dangerous ideas. They spoke in careful whispers about the mandate of heaven, that ancient concept which held that rulers governed only as long as they remained virtuous and effective. When kings became tyrants, when dynasties grew corrupt, the mandate would pass to others, and heaven itself would sanction rebellion. These were not idle academic discussions. Every courtier understood that the philosopher's words carried the weight of revolution, that their careful arguments about celestial mandates and divine disapproval were really questions about the legitimacy of Di-Shin's rule. But the king himself seemed untouched by such concerns, lost in his own world of wine and cruelty, while the foundations of his dynasty crumbled beneath his feet. The Zhou alliance grew stronger with each passing season, fed by the streams of refugees fleeing Shang territory and the whispered tales of atrocities committed in the dear terrace palace. Wu of Zhou proved to be a master of both warfare and propaganda, painting himself as heaven's chosen instrument, while portraying Di-Shin as a monster who had forfeited his right to rule. The smaller kingdoms began to waver, their loyalty eroded by doubt and fear. When the final confrontation came, it came at Muye, where the armies of two worlds met in the pale light of dawn. The battle itself was over almost before it began, the Shang forces dissolving like morning mist when faced with the disciplined ranks of the Zhou coalition. Di Xin's generals, those same men who had watched the roasting log performances with calculated indifference, now switched sides with the practiced ease of professional survivors. The king himself fought with the desperate fury of a man who had suddenly realized that his comfortable world was ending. But fury cannot make up for years of neglect, and personal valor cannot compensate for systematic corruption. His bodyguards fell around him like autumn leaves. His chariots were overrun by Zhou infantry, and the great army of the Shang became a stream of refugees flowing back toward the capital. The retreat to the Deer Terrace Palace was a journey through a kingdom transformed. The cities Di Xin had known as centers of wealth and culture now stood half empty, their gates barred against both their king and his enemies. The peasants who watched his bedraggled procession pass showed neither respect nor hatred, only the hollow-eyed indifference of people who had suffered too much to care about the fate of dynasties. In the palace's highest chamber, surrounded by treasures that no longer had meaning, Di Xin made his final choice. The Zhou armies were at the gates, their war cries echoing through the corridors like the voices of vengeful gods. The king could have surrendered, could have begged for mercy, could have tried to negotiate terms for his survival. Instead, he chose the path of fire. The pyre was built from the palace's most precious timbers, seasoned wood that had been carved by master craftsmen into screens and furniture of impossible beauty. Di Xin arranged it himself, working with the focused intensity of a man who had found his true calling at last. Layer by layer, he built a monument to his own reign, a funeral pyre worthy of a king who had lived by fire and would die by fire. The jewels came next, heaped upon the wood like offerings to some terrible god. Jade from the distant mountains, pearls from the southern seas, gold worked into shapes of dragons and phoenixy soul of it, destined for the flames. The king dressed himself in his finest robes, placed his crown upon his head, and climbed to the top of his creation. The fire caught quickly, eager as young love, hungry as winter. It licked at the precious timbers, embraced the piled treasures, reached up toward the man who had built it with his own hands. Di Xin stood motionless as the flames rose around him, his face serene as a temple statue, his eyes fixed on something beyond the reach of mortal sight. The Zhou soldiers found only ashes when they finally broke through the palace doors. Ashes and the twisted remains of a crown, and the lingering scent of sandalwood and burned dreams. The Deer Terrace Palace stood empty now, its terraced gardens already beginning to show the first signs of neglect, its wine pools reflecting nothing but the empty sky. The hush that followed was profound, like the silence after a great bell has finished ringing. It settled over the ruined palace like dust, crept through the abandoned chambers like a living thing, whispered in the corridors where the roasting log stood cold and forgotten. This was the sound of an empire ending, not with the clash of bronze on bronze, but with the soft sigh of ashes settling into patterns that would soon be scattered by the wind. And in that silence, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of laughter from summer nights that would never come again. The ghost of music played on instruments that had turned to smoke, the memory of a king who had thought that fear was the same as respect, that cruelty was the same as strength, that the mandate of heaven was something that could be held by force rather than earned through wisdom. The yellow river flowed on, indifferent to dynasties and their rise and fall, carrying the silt of ages toward the sea. And somewhere in that endless flow, the dreams of the Shang dynasty dissolved like salt in water, joining the countless other dreams that had thought themselves eternal and learned, too late, that even the mightiest fires eventually burn themselves out. CROESUS of Lydia. The evening light fell golden across the hills of Sardis, painting the world in shades of amber and honey, as if the very air had been transformed into the precious metal that had made one man the richest king who ever lived. CROESUS sat in his palace garden, watching servants measure gold dust with scales so delicate they trembled at the touch of a feather, and felt the weight of fortune settling on his shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight itself. This was the hour when the merchants came to pay their respects, when the tribute-bearers arrived from distant lands, when the very stones of Sardis seemed to glow with reflected wealth. The king's treasury held more gold than had ever been gathered in one place since the world began, enough to buy armies, to build cities, to transform the dreams of mortal men into gleaming reality. And yet, for all his wealth, Croesus felt the strange hollowness that comes to those who have everything and still hunger for more. The gold came from the river Pactolus, which flowed through Lydia like a vein of liquid metal, its waters sparkling with the dust of the precious element that had made the kingdom famous throughout the ancient world. Legend said that King Midas had once bathed in these waters, washing away his golden curse and leaving behind a river that would enrich his descendants for generations. Whether the tale was true or not, the gold was real enough, and it flowed through Croesus's fingers like water through cupped hands. But gold, as the king was beginning to learn, was a peculiar kind of power. It could buy loyalty, but not love. It could purchase armies, but not victory. It could acquire wisdom, but not understanding. And as Croesus sat in his garden, weighing the precious dust in his hands, he felt the first stirrings of the restlessness that would ultimately destroy everything he had built. The problem was Cyrus, that upstart Persian who had been conquering his way across the known world with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. Reports came daily to the Lydian court of cities fallen, of armies scattered, of kings reduced to vassals or corpses. The Persian Empire grew like a shadow at noon, expanding in all directions with relentless, terrible efficiency. Croesus could have fortified his borders, could have built alliances, could have prepared for the coming storm with the same careful attention he gave to his treasury accounts. Instead, he chose to consult the oracle at Delphi, that ancient voice of the gods which spoke in riddles and smoke from a sacred cave in the mountains of Greece. The journey to Delphi was a procession worthy of a god, the king's retinue stretching across the landscape like a golden river flowing toward the sea. Croesus brought gifts that would have bankrupted lesser kingdoms, statues of pure gold, bowls encrusted with gems, tripods worked by master craftsmen into shapes of impossible beauty. The oracle must surely be impressed, must surely give him the clear guidance he sought. But oracles, as men discover too late, have their own ways of speaking truth. The Pythia, that sacred priestess who channeled the voice of Apollo himself, breathed the divine vapors and spoke words that would echo through the centuries. If Croesus crosses the river Halys, he will destroy a great empire. The king heard what he wanted to hear, as men always do when faced with prophecy. A great empire would fall. Surely this meant the Persian Empire, Cyrus's growing realm that threatened to swallow the civilized world. The oracle had promised him victory, had given him divine sanction for the war he was already planning. He returned to Sardis with the confident stride of a man who had looked into the future and found it to his liking. The preparations for war consumed the winter months like a fever. Croesus hired the finest mercenaries gold could buy, Greek hoplites with their bronze armor and long spears, Scythian archers with their composite bows, Celtic warriors with their iron swords and berserker fury. The royal armory worked day and night, forging weapons and armor that gleamed like captured sunlight. The treasury, for the first time in living memory, actually began to show signs of strain. But the richest man in the world could afford any price, or so he told himself. Gold flowed like water, purchasing supplies and equipment, buying loyalty and courage, transforming the wealth of generations into the instruments of war. The army that assembled on the plains outside Sardis was a sight to inspire poets and terrify enemies, a glittering host that seemed to catch fire in the morning sun. Spring came early that year, and with it the time for campaigns. Croesus led his golden army across the river Halys, with the confidence of a man who had divine approval for his actions. The Persian winter lay ahead, but winter was just another obstacle to be overcome with sufficient wealth and determination. The oracle had spoken, the gods had chosen their champion, and the richest man in the world was about to become the most powerful as well. The snow began to fall almost as soon as they crossed the river, soft white flakes that seemed harmless enough at first but gradually accumulated into something more serious. The Persian winter was not like the mild Mediterranean climate Croesus knew, but a savage beast that bit with teeth of ice and claws of wind. The golden army, so magnificent in the warm sunshine of Lydia, began to transform into something altogether more pitiful. The mercenaries, those professional soldiers who had seemed so confident in their bronze armor, now huddled around inadequate fires and cursed the day they had taken Persian gold. The horses, bred for the gentle hills of Lydia, struggled through snowdrifts that reached their bellies. The supply trains, so carefully organized back in Sardis, began to fall behind as the oxen died and the wheels broke on the frozen ground. And somewhere ahead, moving like a ghost through the white landscape, Cyrus waited with his army of hardy mountain men who had been born in such weather and thrived in conditions that would kill softer civilizations. The Persian king had no need for golden armor or exotic mercenaries. He had something far more valuable: soldiers who belonged to the land they fought for, who saw hardship as a test of character rather than an obstacle to overcome. The battle, when it finally came, was less a clash of armies than a demonstration of the difference between wealth and power. Croesus's golden host, so impressive in the sunshine of Lydia, melted away like snow in spring rain. The mercenaries, their loyalty purchased rather than earned, had no particular reason to die for a foreign king's ambitions. The exotic weapons and armor, so costly to acquire, proved less effective than the simple efficiency of Persian steel and Persian determination. The retreat to Sardis was a journey through a landscape transformed by defeat. The cities that had seemed so loyal when Croesus was winning now barred their gates against their own king. The peasants who had once brought tribute now watched his bedraggled army pass with the careful neutrality of people who had learned to survive by backing winners. The golden river of conquest had become a muddy stream of refugees flowing back toward a capital that might no longer welcome them. The siege of Sardis lasted 14 days, 2 weeks during which the richest man in the world learned that walls of stone are more durable than walls of gold. The Persian army surrounded the city like a noose, tightening gradually until the very air seemed to grow thin. The treasury, that marvel of accumulated wealth, now served only to taunt its owner with the memory of better days. The city fell not through assault but through betrayal, a Persian soldier finding a hidden path up the supposedly impregnable cliff face that protected Sardis from attack. The defenders, seeing enemy soldiers appearing where none should have been able to climb, lost heart and fled. The gates opened as if by magic, and the Persians flowed into the city like water, filling a broken vessel. The palace burned in colors that would have been beautiful under other circumstances, the flames painting the night sky in shades of orange and red, the smoke rising like incense offered to indifferent gods. The treasury, that accumulation of centuries, was opened to provide tribute for a new master. The gold that had once made Croesus the richest man alive now served to finance Cyrus's next campaign, the precious metal flowing eastward to fund the expansion of the Persian Empire. Croesus himself survived, though survival in such circumstances was perhaps a crueler fate than death. Cyrus, in a gesture that was equal parts mercy and diplomacy, spared the fallen king's life and even granted him a place at the Persian court. The richest man in the world became a pensioner, a living reminder of the transience of fortune and the dangers of misreading divine will. The oracle's prophecy had been fulfilled, though not in the way Croesus had expected. A great empire had indeed fallen when he crossed the river Halys, but it was his own Lydian kingdom that had been destroyed, not the Persian realm he had sought to conquer. The gods, it seemed, had a sense of irony that mortal men could only appreciate in retrospect. The gold coins continued to be minted in Sardis, but they bore Persian inscriptions now, the elegant cuneiform of Cyrus's scribes replacing the familiar Greek letters that had once proclaimed Lydian independence. The river Pactolus still flowed with its burden of precious metal, but its wealth now served a different master, fed a different dream of empire. And in the ruins of what had once been the richest palace in the world, the wind whistled through empty chambers where golden dust still glittered in the corners, catching the moonlight like fallen stars. The weight of fortune, it seemed, was not always measured in gold, and the richest man alive could become the poorest in the space of a single winter, when the gods decided that wealth was not the same as worth, and that some lessons could only be learned through loss. CAMBYSES, Eye of Persia. The great gates of Memphis opened like the petals of a stone flower, and through them rode Cambyses II of Persia, son of Cyrus the Great, conqueror of Egypt, master of the world's oldest civilization. The morning sun painted the Nile Delta in shades of gold and green, while the ancient pyramids watched from the western horizon like silent judges presiding over the transfer of power from one empire to another. This should have been Cambyses' moment of greatest triumph, the culmination of Persian expansion into the heart of Africa itself. The Egyptian priests lined the processional way, their white linen robes rustling in the warm breeze that carried the scent of lotus blossoms and incense from 1,000 temples. They had chosen submission over destruction, these keepers of mysteries older than memory, and now they bowed their shaved heads before the Persian king with the fluid grace of reeds bending before the wind. The great Sphinx seemed to smile, its eternal smile as Cambyses passed, as if it knew secrets that mortal conquerors could never fathom. But conquest, as the young king was about to learn, is easier than rule, and power over bodies is simpler than dominion over souls. Egypt was not like the other lands that had fallen to Persian arms. It was a civilization that had been ancient when Babylon was young, a realm where the dead were more important than the living, where the gods walked among men in forms both beautiful and terrible. The Nile itself seemed to pulse with a life force that no foreign king could truly command. The first signs of trouble came soft as whispers, subtle as shadows lengthening at dusk. Cambyses had inherited his father's throne but not his father's wisdom, his father's empire but not his father's understanding of how to hold it. Where Cyrus had been content to rule through local customs and established hierarchies, the son felt compelled to impose his will more directly, to demonstrate that Persian power was absolute and Persian ways superior. The paranoia began as a small thing, a nagging doubt that crept into the king's mind like water seeping through stone. His brother Bardia remained in Persia, governing the eastern provinces with competence and growing popularity. The reports that reached Memphis spoke of a young man who shared his father's gift for inspiring loyalty, who commanded respect from both nobles and commoners. In Cambyses' fevered imagination, this respect began to look like preparation for rebellion. The decision to eliminate Bardia came in the dead of night, whispered orders given to trusted assassins who would travel the long road back to Persia, carrying death in their saddlebags. The deed was done quietly, efficiently, with the kind of professional competence that leaves no witnesses and few regrets. But fratricide, as the Persian king would learn, is a poison that works both ways, corrupting the killer as surely as it kills the victim. The news of his brother's death reached Cambyses as he stood in the great temple of Ptah, surrounded by the ancient stone pillars that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties beyond counting. The messenger's words should have brought relief, should have lifted the weight of suspicion from the king's shoulders. Instead, they seemed to settle there like lead, a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Egypt itself began to feel different after that, as if the very air had thickened with invisible judgment. The priests still bowed, the nobles still paid tribute, the common people still went about their daily lives with the patient endurance of those who had survived countless conquests. But there was something in their eyes now, a quality of watchful waiting that suggested they saw more than they revealed. The sacred bull Apis dwelt in the temple of Pa like a living god, its black hide marked with the white symbols that proclaimed its divine nature. For 3,000 years, the Egyptians had worshipped such bulls, believing them to be the earthly manifestation of the Creator God himself. Each bull was selected according to ancient prophecies, pampered and honored throughout its life, mourned and mummified at its death, with ceremonies that rivaled royal funerals. But to Cambyses, drunk on his own power and poisoned by his brother's blood, the bull was just another symbol of Egyptian otherness. Another reminder that this land he had conquered still refused to truly accept Persian rule. The king entered the temple with the calculated blasphemy of a man who had decided that destroying local customs was the surest path to absolute dominion. The spear thrust came swift and sure, the bronze point piercing the bull's flank with a sound like silk tearing. The sacred animal bellowed once, a sound that echoed through the temple chambers like the voice of offended divinity itself, then collapsed in a spreading pool of blood that seemed to stain not just the stone floor, but the very air around it. The priests stood frozen in horror, their faces pale as their linen robes, while the king laughed with the harsh sound of a man who had mistaken sacrilege for strength. The consequences came swift as divine retribution, terrible as prophecy fulfilled. The Nile, which had risen and fallen with clockwork precision for millennia, began to behave strangely. The floods came too early or too late, too high or too low, bringing either drought or destruction, instead of the life-giving silt that had sustained Egyptian civilization since the dawn of time. The priests whispered that the gods were angry, that the sacred order had been broken, that the foreign king had brought a curse upon the land. But Cambyses, his mind now thoroughly poisoned by suspicion and guilt, saw treachery everywhere. The irregular floods were not divine punishment but human sabotage. The priests' prayers were not pleas for forgiveness, but coded communications with rebels. The very stones of the temples seemed to watch him with hostile eyes, and the ancient hieroglyphs on the walls appeared to shift and writhe like living things in the flickering torchlight. The king's response was to double down on his conquest, to push deeper into the mysteries of Africa itself. If Egypt would not submit willingly, then he would demonstrate the full extent of Persian power by conquering lands that no foreign army had ever reached. The deserts of the south called to him with promises of gold and glory, while the western shores beckoned with tales of wealthy cities ripe for plunder. The campaign toward Ethiopia began with the confidence of a man who had forgotten that the desert is not conquered, but merely survived. The Persian army, accustomed to the green valleys of their homeland, marched into a landscape that seemed hostile to life itself. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, the sand burned through leather sandals, and the water supplies that had seemed adequate in Memphis began to dwindle with alarming speed. The men began to fall first from heat exhaustion, then from thirst, then from the strange fever that comes to those who have pushed too far beyond the reach of civilization. The supply trains, stretched thin across impossible distances, began to break down as the oxen died and the caravans were swallowed by sandstorms that rose from the desert floor like the breath of angry gods. But the greatest disaster was yet to come. The army of 50,000 that Cambyses sent westward toward the oracle of Ammon simply vanished, swallowed by the desert as completely as if it had never existed. No messenger returned. No survivor staggered back with tales of the catastrophe. The greatest fighting force in the world simply walked into the empty quarter and disappeared like a dream dissolving at dawn. The king received the news in his tent on the banks of the Nile, where the evening air carried the scent of lotus blossoms and the distant sound of temple bells. 50,000 men, the cream of the Persian army, had simply ceased to exist. The desert had claimed them as surely as the sea claims drowning sailors, and there would be no graves to mark their passing, no monuments to commemorate their sacrifice. The weight of the loss settled on Cambyses like a shroud woven from sand and silence. He was no longer the conqueror of Egypt, but but the king who had fed an army to the desert's hunger. The Persian Empire, which had seemed so solid and permanent, now felt as fragile as a house built on shifting sand. The gods, it seemed, had found a way to balance the scales of justice. The madness came gradually, like fever climbing through the body's defenses. Cambyses began to see conspiracies everywhere, to hear whispers of rebellion in the wind itself. His remaining generals watched him with the careful attention of men who had learned to read the signs of royal instability. The Egyptian priests, those survivors of his earlier persecutions, prayed in their hidden sanctuaries for deliverance from the foreign tyrant who had brought nothing but chaos to their ancient land. The end came with the terrible logic of Greek tragedy, self-inflicted and yet somehow inevitable. The king, examining his sword in the pale light of dawn, accidentally cut his own thigh with the weapon's edge. The wound was not deep, hardly more than a scratch, but it festered in the Egyptian heat, like a symbol of the corruption that had spread through the empire itself. The fever took him slowly, burning away the last remnants of the young man who had once dreamed of surpassing his father's achievements. As he lay dying in his tent beside the Nile, Cambyses could hear the sound of the river flowing past, carrying the silt of ages toward the sea. The water was the same that had nourished pharaohs and commoners alike for thousands of years, indifferent to the rise and fall of dynasties, patient as only the truly eternal can be patient. The Persian Empire did not fall with its king's death, but it trembled like a building in an earthquake, its foundations shaken by the realization that even the mightiest rulers were subject to the same frailties that afflicted ordinary men. The governors and generals who had served Cambyses now looked toward the homeland with uncertainty, wondering who would claim the throne and whether the vast realm could survive the transition. In the temples of Memphis, the priests offered prayers of thanksgiving to gods, who had demonstrated once again that hubris carries its own punishment. The sacred bull Apis was dead, but new bulls would be found. New ceremonies would be performed. New cycles of worship would begin. The Egyptians had learned long ago that empires come and go, but the Nile flows forever, and the gods are more patient than the men who claim to serve them. The desert wind blew across the empty spaces where 50,000 soldiers had vanished, carrying sand that would cover their bones and silence that would preserve their memory. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, the greatest army in the world had learned the final lesson about the limits of mortal power, about the difference between conquering land and understanding it, about the price of forgetting that some forces are beyond human control. And in the fading light of empire, as the sun set over the Nile Delta in shades of gold and crimson, the ancient pyramids watched with their eternal patience, having seen this story before and knowing they would see it again. Kings would come and go, empires would rise and fall, but the desert would endure, and the gods would remember everything. Sardanapalus, sign, Shah, Ishkun, of Assyria. The legend speaks of a king who feasted while his empire burned, who chose silk over steel, who preferred the touch of roses to the weight of a crown. History whispers a different tale, of a ruler who inherited an empire already cracking at its foundations, who fought desperately against forces that no single man could have contained. But legends, like wine, improve with age, and the story of Sardanapalus has been aged in the imagination of poets and storytellers until it gleams like honey in the firelight. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between legend and history, in the shadowed spaces where fact dissolves into myth and myth hardens into something that feels more real than reality itself. Sin Shah Eshkun, last king of Assyria, ruled from Nineveh in the dying days of the 7th century before Christ, when the empire that had terrorized the ancient world for 3 centuries was finally collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The banquet hall stretched away into perfumed darkness, its walls adorned with reliefs that told the story of Assyrian triumphs. Lions falling beneath royal arrows, enemies kneeling before the throne, tribute flowing like rivers from conquered lands. The air was thick with the scent of lotus blossoms and frankincense, while musicians played soft melodies on instruments carved from ivory and strung with silver wire. This was the world Sardanapalus had inherited, a realm of impossible luxury built on the foundation of systematic terror. But even as the king reclined among his courtiers, even as the wine flowed and the dancers swayed in the lamplight, the distant sound of battering rams could be heard echoing through the city's streets. The Babylonians had come north with their Median allies, bringing with them the accumulated rage of generations who had suffered under Assyrian rule. The siege of Nineveh had begun, and with it the final chapter of an empire that had once made the earth tremble. The irony was perfect, in the way that history sometimes arranges its endings with the aesthetic sense of a master playwright. Here was Sardanapalus, surrounded by luxury that would have made Persian kings weep with envy, dining on delicacies from the ends of the earth, while his capital was slowly strangled by enemy armies. The contrast was too perfect to be entirely true, but truth, in such moments, matters less than the story's power to illuminate the human condition. The king himself was not the decadent weakling of legend, though legend serves its own purposes, and truth is sometimes too complex for moral instruction. Sin-Shar-Ishkun had fought for his throne, had led armies in the field, had shown the kind of desperate courage that comes to men who find themselves defending the impossible. But Assyria was dying from within, its provinces in revolt, its armies scattered, its treasury empty, despite centuries of plunder. The empire had grown too large for any single ruler to control, too complex for any single system to manage. The very success that had made Assyria the terror of the ancient world had also sown the seeds of its destruction. Every conquered city harbored dreams of revenge. Every vassal king plotted rebellion. Every tribute payment was made with the kind of sullen resentment that eventually explodes into violence. The Babylonians remembered the destruction of their city, the temple of Marduk desecrated, the sacred statues carried off to Assyrian temples like trophies of war. The Medes remembered the campaigns that had driven them from their traditional lands, the harsh tribute that had impoverished their people, the hostages taken from noble families to ensure compliance. The Scythians remembered the raids that had scattered their tribes, the broken promises, the casual cruelty that had marked every interaction with Assyrian power. Now they had all come to Nineveh, drawn by the scent of weakness, like wolves gathering around a wounded beast. The city's walls were still strong, its defenders still brave, but the will to resist was crumbling like old mortar. The provincial governors had stopped sending reinforcements, the vassal kings had declared their independence, and the great war machine that had once seemed invincible now ran on empty. In the palace, the banquets continued with the desperate gaiety of a funeral feast. The courtiers still bowed, the musicians still played, the dancers still moved with graceful precision through routines that had been perfected over generations. But there was something hollow in their movements now, something forced in their laughter, as if they were all actors in a play that had run too long and lost its audience. Sardanapalus himself seemed to float through these final days like a man walking in his sleep, going through the motions of kingship while the substance of power slipped away like water through his fingers. The reports from the walls grew more desperate each day, the enemy lines drew closer each night, and still the king maintained the fiction that this was just another siege, just another test of Assyrian strength. The gardens of the palace bloomed with flowers brought from the ends of the earth, their exotic fragrances mixing with the smoke that now rose from the city's burning districts. The fountains still played their crystal music. The peacocks still strutted across manicured lawns. The slaves still tended the fruit trees that had been planted by kings whose names were already forgotten. But the sound of digging could be heard beneath the music, the sound of enemy sappers undermining the walls that had protected Nineveh for 3 centuries. The breach came at dawn, when the city was still wrapped in the grey mist that rose from the Tigris like the breath of sleeping gods. The Babylonian engineers had done their work well, tunneling beneath the great walls and packing the excavated spaces with timber and pitch. The fire spread quickly through the wooden supports, and when they collapsed, they took with them a section of wall that had never been breached by enemy action. The defenders fought with the courage of men who had nothing left to lose, meeting the enemy in the breach with bronze and iron, with spear and sword, with the kind of desperate fury that sometimes turns defeat into victory. But there were too many enemies, too many grievances to be settled, too many scores to be balanced. The Assyrian soldiers, outnumbered and outflanked, began to give ground. The palace tapestries caught fire first, those magnificent works of art that had taken skilled craftsmen years to complete. The flames spread from silk to wood to everything that would burn, painting the night sky in shades of orange and crimson. The smoke rose like incense offered to vengeful gods, carrying with it the scent of burning cedar and the dreams of an empire that had ruled the world for 300 years. Sardanapalus faced his final choice with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes to men in their darkest hour. He could flee, could try to escape through the palace's secret passages, could spend his remaining years as a refugee in some distant court. He could surrender, could throw himself on the mercy of his enemies, could hope that they would be satisfied with mere conquest rather than vengeance. Or he could choose the path of fire, the ending that legend would remember and history would record. The pyre was built in the palace's innermost courtyard, where the king had often walked in the cool of evening, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The servants piled it high with precious timbers, seasoned wood that had been carved by master craftsmen into furniture of impossible beauty. The flames would feed well on such fuel, would burn bright and hot and leave nothing but ash and memory. The king dressed himself in his finest robes, placed his crown upon his head, and walked to the pyre with the measured pace of a man who had found his destiny at last. Around him, the palace burned like a furnace, its corridors filled with smoke and the sound of approaching enemies. But in the courtyard, there was only the sound of wood crackling and the whisper of wind through the flames. The fire took him quickly, embracing him like a lover, lifting him toward the stars that had watched over Assyria since its founding. The smoke rose black against the dawn sky, carrying with it the soul of a king and the dreams of an empire that had learned too late that power without justice is just another form of weakness. The hush that settled over Nineveh was profound, like the silence that follows a great storm. The city still burned in places, the victorious armies still celebrated in the streets, but there was something in the air that felt like completion, like the closing of a book that had been too long in the writing. The Assyrian Empire was dead, and with it an age of the world that would never come again. The Tigris flowed on, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, carrying the silt of ages toward the sea. The river had seen cities rise and fall along its banks, had witnessed the birth and death of kingdoms, had flowed past the palaces of kings whose names were now forgotten. It would flow past the ruins of Nineveh with the same patient indifference, washing away the ash and the memory until nothing remained but the eternal conversation between water and stone. And in that flow, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of harps and the whisper of silk, the ghost of laughter from banquet halls that would never know joy again, the memory of a king who had chosen fire over flight, who had learned that sometimes the most courageous act is simply to accept the ending that history has written for you. Rehoboam of Israel. The morning sun painted the hills of Shechem in shades of gold and amber, while the ancient terebinth trees rustled with the same gentle whispers that had sheltered Abraham and blessed Jacob in the days when the world was young. Here, in this sacred grove, where the promises of God had first been made to the children of Israel, the elders of the 12 tribes gathered to crown a new king and, unknowingly, to witness the beginning of the end of their united kingdom. Rehoboam stood beneath the spreading branches, feeling the weight of his father's crown settle on his brow like a burden he had never asked to bear. Solomon was dead, that wise king who had built the temple in Jerusalem and made Israel great among the nations. Now his son must take up the scepter and try to hold together a kingdom that had grown rich but restless, prosperous but increasingly divided between the demands of God and the appetites of men. The coronation ceremony unfolded with the ancient dignity of a people who had learned to make their rituals beautiful, even in times of uncertainty. The priests anointed the new king with oil pressed from olives that had grown in the soil of the Promised Land, while the singers chanted psalms that had been old when David was young. The bronze censers sent up clouds of frankincense that seemed to carry the prayers of the people toward heaven itself. But even as the sacred words were spoken, even as the crown was placed and the scepter handed down, there was an undertone of tension in the air, a sense that this ceremony was not a beginning but an ending, not a coronation but a funeral for something that had been precious and might never be recovered. The elders who had come to acclaim their new king carried with them the grievances of their people, the accumulated burdens of Solomon's reign. The old king had been wise, but wisdom had come at a price. The temple in Jerusalem was a marvel of gold and cedar, but it had been built with forced labor that had turned free men into slaves. The palace was a wonder of ivory and bronze, but it had been paid for with taxes that had impoverished the common people. The kingdom was strong, but its strength rested on the bent backs of men who had begun to remember that they were supposed to be free. Jeroboam stood among the elders, his weathered face showing the marks of years spent in Egyptian exile, his eyes holding the kind of patient intensity that comes to men who have learned to wait for their moment. He had been Solomon's overseer once, had seen the cost of royal ambition measured in human suffering, had fled to Egypt when his criticisms grew too pointed for the old king's comfort. Now he had returned, carrying with him the hopes of the northern tribes and the promise of a different kind of leadership. The petition came formally, presented with the careful courtesy that subjects owe to kings, but carrying beneath its polite words the weight of an ultimatum. The elders spoke of the heavy yoke that Solomon had placed upon their necks, of the forced labor that had taken their sons from the fields, of the taxes that had turned prosperity into poverty. They asked for relief, for a lighter touch, for the kind of governance that remembered that kings exist to serve their people rather than the other way around. Rehoboam listened with the distracted attention of a young man who had grown up in the palace, who had never known want or understood the weight of physical labor. The complaints seemed abstract to him, the grievances distant and theoretical. Surely these people understood that greatness required sacrifice, that the glory of Israel had been built on the foundation of shared burden and common purpose. The kingdom his father had built was worth preserving, even if it demanded continued sacrifice from its people. The king asked for 3 days to consider his answer, 3 days that would determine the fate of a kingdom and the future of a people. In the palace chambers, he consulted with 2 very different groups of advisors, each representing a different vision of leadership and a different understanding of the relationship between ruler and ruled. The older counselors, those grey-bearded men who had served Solomon through his long reign, spoke with the voice of experience and the wisdom of age. They understood the temper of the people, the limits of what could be demanded, the importance of governing with a light hand. Their advice was simple: grant the petition, reduce the burden, rule with mercy rather than force. A king who serves his people will find that they serve him willingly, while a king who oppresses them will discover that oppression breeds rebellion. But the younger men, those who had grown up in the palace alongside Rehoboam, spoke with the confidence of youth and the arrogance of privilege. They had never known hardship, had never seen the cost of royal ambition paid in human suffering. To them, the petition was not a reasonable request, but a challenge to royal authority, a test of strength that required a firm response. A king who yields to pressure will find that pressure increases, while a king who demonstrates his power will find that power respected. The debate continued through the long hours of the night, voices rising and falling like the tide, arguments flowing back and forth like water seeking its level. The older counselors spoke of David, who had ruled with justice and mercy, who had made himself beloved by governing with wisdom and restraint. The younger advisors invoked Solomon, who had built great works and made Israel feared among the nations through the display of power and the accumulation of wealth. The dawn of the third day came grey and cool, with clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen of the storm to come. The elders assembled again in the sacred grove, their faces showing the hope and anxiety of men who had waited 3 days for an answer that would determine the fate of their children and their children's children. The wind stirred the leaves of the ancient trees, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of change. Rehoboam stood before his people with the bearing of a king who had made his choice, who had decided to follow the counsel of youth rather than the wisdom of age. His words, when they came, fell like hammer blows on the morning air. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will make it heavier. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. The silence that followed was profound, like the hush that precedes an earthquake. The elders stared at their king with the expression of men who had hoped for bread and been given stones, who had asked for relief and been promised greater burdens. The ancient covenant between ruler and ruled, that sacred bond that had held Israel together since the days of the judges, seemed to crack like pottery in the morning air. Jeroboam was the first to speak, his voice carrying across the grove with the authority of a man who had found his moment at last. What portion have we in David? He cried, invoking the old formula of rebellion that had echoed through Israel's history. Neither have we inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, David. The words spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass, igniting the anger that had been building through 3 days of waiting and a generation of oppression. The northern tribes, those 10 portions of Israel that had always been restive under southern rule, began to drift away from the coronation grove like smoke dispersing in the wind. They had come to crown a king and had instead witnessed the birth of a revolution. The kingdom split that day, not with the clash of bronze on bronze, but with the quiet sound of men walking away from a covenant that had been broken by its guardian. The 10 northern tribes followed Jeroboam toward a future that would be uncertain but at least would be their own, while the southern tribes remained loyal to the house of David and the promises that had been made to their ancestors. Rehoboam stood in the emptying grove, watching his kingdom divide like a garment torn in two, feeling the weight of his crown become suddenly heavier as the number of heads it ruled grew smaller. The ancient trees still rustled with the same gentle whispers, but now they seemed to carry the sound of lamentation rather than blessing, the echo of opportunities lost and wisdom ignored. The sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the hills in the harsh light of noon, while 2 processions moved away from Shechem in opposite directions. To the north went the majority of Israel, following a king who promised them lighter burdens and a government that would remember its obligations to the governed. To the south went the remnant of the United Kingdom, carrying with them the memory of David and Solomon and the hope that faithfulness to the old ways would somehow preserve what remained of their inheritance. The kingdoms that emerged from this division would endure for centuries, sometimes allied, sometimes at war, always conscious of what they had lost in the moment when a young king chose harshness over mercy, when pride overcame wisdom, when the promise of unity was sacrificed on the altar of royal prerogative. The northern kingdom would be called Israel. The southern kingdom would be called Judah, and between them would lie the ghost of what might have been. Jerusalem continued to glitter in the southern sun, its temple still magnificent, its palace still splendid, but somehow diminished by the knowledge that it now ruled over a fragment rather than a whole. The city that had been the capital of a great kingdom became the capital of a smaller realm, still significant, but no longer the center of a united people's dreams. In Samaria, the new capital of the northern kingdom, different altars were built and different prayers were offered, as Jeroboam established a separate religious system to match his separate political authority. The unity that had been forged in the wilderness and tested in the promised land was broken, perhaps forever. by a few harsh words spoken in the shade of ancient trees. The wind continued to blow across the hills of Shechem, carrying with it the memory of a kingdom that had chosen division over unity, of a king who had mistaken strength for wisdom, of a people who had learned that sometimes the most expensive words are those spoken in anger. The terebinth trees still rustled with their ancient whispers, but now they seemed to be saying that some things, once broken, can never be repaired, and that the heaviest yoke of all is the one that kings place upon themselves when they forget that their power comes from the consent of the governed. Tarquinius Superbus. The Cloaca Maxima yawned in the Roman dawn like the mouth of some great beast, its stone throat swallowing the filth and waste of a city that had grown beyond the dreams of its founders. The great sewer was Tarquin's masterpiece, a monument to Roman engineering that would outlast the kingdom itself, carved from the living rock by the hands of men who had been forced to choose between labor and death. The rising sun painted the massive stones in shades of gold and crimson, while the sound of pickaxes and hammers echoed from the depths like the heartbeat of a city being born in pain. Tarquinius Superbus stood on the construction site, watching his subjects toil in the shadows below, and felt the satisfaction of a man who had learned to measure greatness by the weight of stone moved and the depth of foundations laid. Rome was growing under his rule, expanding beyond the 7 hills that had once contained it, reaching toward a destiny that would make it the master of the Mediterranean world. But greatness, as the king was about to learn, could be built on foundations too brittle to support the weight of ambition. The laborers worked in shifts that began before dawn and ended after dusk, their bodies bent beneath the burden of building an empire that would never acknowledge their sacrifice. These were not slaves taken in conquest, but Roman citizens, men who had once farmed their own land and followed their own trades, now pressed into service by a king who had forgotten that free men must consent to be governed. The Cloaca Maxima was indeed a wonder of engineering, but it was also a symbol of the transformation of Roman society from a community of equals into a hierarchy of masters and servants. The king himself was not a monster, though history would remember him as one. He was simply a man who had inherited power and mistaken it for wisdom, who had been born to rule and never learned to serve. The engineering projects that marked his reign were genuine achievements, marvels of construction that would endure for centuries. But they were built at a cost that no free people should have been asked to pay, a cost measured not in gold or silver, but in the dignity and liberty of those who had once called themselves Romans. The trouble began, as such troubles often do, in the space between public duty and private desire, in the moment when a man with power encounters someone who has what he wants but cannot be bought. Sextus Tarquinius was the king's son, raised in the palace, accustomed to having his wishes become commands, his desires transformed into realities by the mere fact of his royal birth. He had never learned that some things cannot be taken, that some people cannot be compelled, that some victories cost more than defeats. Lucretia was the wife of Collatinus, a noblewoman whose beauty was matched only by her virtue, whose reputation for chastity had become almost legendary in a court where such qualities were increasingly rare. She lived quietly in her husband's house, tending to her household duties, caring for her family, embodying the traditional Roman values that the monarchy had begun to corrode. She was, in many ways, the last symbol of the Rome that had existed before the kings had taught the people to bow their heads. The assault came in the darkness of night, when the city slept and the guards dozed at their posts. Sextus Tarquinius entered Collatinus's house not as a guest but as a conqueror, bringing with him the arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. The details of what followed are too terrible to recount in full, but the essence was simple. A woman's honor was destroyed by a man who confused power with right, who believed that royal blood gave him dominion over the bodies and souls of his subjects. Lucretia's response was swift and final, the act of a woman who had learned that death was preferable to dishonor, that some violations could only be answered by the ultimate sacrifice. She gathered her male relatives around her, told them what had been done, and then took her own life with a blade that had been blessed by the gods of hearth and home. Her blood spilled on the stone floor of her husband's house like wine poured out in libation, a sacrifice that would water the seeds of revolution. The story spread through Rome like fire through dry grass, growing in the telling, gaining power with each repetition. Lucretia's death became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the monarchy, a focal point for the anger that had been building through years of forced labor and royal arrogance. The nobles who had once competed for positions at court now gathered in secret, their voices dropping to whispers as they spoke of things that had once been unthinkable. Lucius Junius Brutus was among those who heard the story first, and in his hearing, something changed that would alter the course of history. He was a man who had learned to hide his intelligence behind a mask of simplicity, who had survived the dangerous years of Tarquin's reign by appearing harmless and unthreatening. But the death of Lucretia had awakened something in him, a recognition that there are moments when silence becomes complicity, when safety becomes cowardice, when the very foundations of civilization demand that good men risk everything to preserve what remains of decency. The conspirators met in the shadows of the Forum, where the ancient shrines of the gods looked down on men who were about to change the world. They came from the great families of Rome, these nobles who had once competed for royal favor, but now found themselves united by a common disgust for what their city had become. They spoke in whispers of republic and liberty, of government by law rather than by the whims of kings, of a Rome where citizens would choose their leaders rather than inherit them. The word itself was dangerous. Republic, res publica, the public thing, the common good. It suggested that power belonged not to individuals but to the people as a whole, that government was a trust rather than a possession, that even the highest offices were temporary gifts to be returned when their term was done. The idea was radical enough to be treasonous, revolutionary enough to be punishable by death, and yet it began to spread through the city like dawn spreading across the 7 hills. The torch-lit colonnades of the palace seemed to whisper with conspiracy as the news reached Tarquin's ears. The king's spies brought reports of secret meetings, of hushed conversations that ended when loyalists approached, of a strange new mood in the city that felt different from the usual grumbling of the oppressed. But Tarquin, secure in his palace and surrounded by his guards, dismissed the reports as the fantasies of nervous informants. What could unarmed nobles do against the power of a king who controlled the army and the treasury? The revolution, when it came, was not a battle, but a revelation. Not a conquest, but a recognition that the emperor had no clothes. The conspirators moved through the city in the grey light of dawn, speaking to the citizens in the Forum, the soldiers in their barracks, the merchants in their shops. They told the story of Lucretia, spoke of the forced labor and the royal arrogance, painted a picture of a Rome that could exist without kings, where free men could govern themselves according to laws rather than the whims of autocrats. The response was swift and overwhelming, like a dam bursting after years of pressure. The people poured into the streets, not with weapons but with a new understanding of their own power, a recognition that they had been consenting to their own oppression and could withdraw that consent as easily as they had given it. The soldiers, those men who had been recruited from the very citizens they were supposed to suppress, began to lay down their arms and join the crowds that filled the Forum. Tarquin received the news in his tent outside the walls of Ardea, where he had been conducting yet another siege to add yet another city to his collection of conquests. The messenger's words seemed to make no sense at first. Rome had declared itself a republic. The monarchy had been abolished. His family had been banished forever from the city they had once ruled. The king stared at the man as if he were speaking a foreign language, unable to comprehend that a system of government that had lasted for centuries could simply evaporate in a single morning. The attempted return was a desperate affair, a march on Rome by a king who had suddenly discovered that kingdoms are not possessions to be inherited but contracts to be renewed. Tarquin's small army approached the city's walls with the confidence of men who expected the gates to open at their approach, who believed that a brief show of force would remind the citizens of their proper place in the order of things. But the walls of Rome remained closed, and the voices that called down from the ramparts spoke words that no Roman king had ever heard before, that the people would not be ruled by tyrants, that the Republic had been born and would not die, that the age of kings was over and the age of citizens had begun. The soldiers who had once marched behind the royal eagles now found themselves facing not enemies but brothers, not foreigners but fellow Romans who had chosen freedom over security. The siege was brief and half-hearted, more a negotiation than a battle. Tarquin's forces melted away like morning mist, his officers defecting to the Republic, his soldiers remembering that they had been Romans before they had been royal troops. The last king of Rome found himself standing almost alone outside the walls of the city he had once ruled, watching the sun set over ramparts that would never again acknowledge his authority. The exile that followed was a slow death, a gradual fading from relevance and power into the grey anonymity of the dispossessed. Tarquin wandered from court to court, seeking allies who would help him reclaim his throne, but finding only polite sympathy and empty promises. The world had moved on, had learned to live without kings, had discovered that republics could be stronger than monarchies when they were founded on the consent of the governed rather than the accident of birth. The tent outside Gabii became his final palace, a canvas structure that could be folded and moved, but never again would shelter a ruling king. Here, in this modest shelter, Tarquin spent his last years contemplating the kingdom he had lost and the world he had helped to create. The republic he had inadvertently founded would endure for centuries, would conquer the Mediterranean world, would give birth to an empire that would make his own achievements seem small by comparison. But perhaps, in the end, that was the greatest irony of all, that the last king of Rome had, by his very failures, created something far greater than any kingdom could have been. The republic that rose from the ashes of the monarchy would prove that free men could govern themselves, that power derived from the consent of the governed was stronger than power derived from the accident of birth, that the public good could triumph over private ambition when citizens chose to make it so. The wind blew across the Alban hills, carrying with it the scent of olive groves and the distant sound of a city that had learned to live without kings. In that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the whisper of a new age being born, the sound of citizens discovering their own power, the echo of a revolution that had been accomplished, not with swords, but with the simple recognition that no one rules by divine right, and that the highest authority in any land is the will of its people, freely given and freely withdrawn. The monarchy was dead, but Rome lived on, transformed and renewed, ready to begin the next chapter of its extraordinary story. The king was gone, but the republic remained, and with it the promise that free men could create something greater than any single ruler could ever achieve. The age of kings was over, but the age of citizens had just begun. Nero. The gardens of the Domus Aurea stretched away into the perfumed darkness like a dream of paradise made manifest in marble and gold, their carefully tended pathways winding between fountains that sang crystal songs to the Roman night. The evening air carried the scent of roses and jasmine, of cedar from distant Lebanon and spices from the markets of Alexandria, while peacocks strutted across manicured lawns that had been watered with the tears of a city's taxes. This was Nero's world, a realm of impossible beauty built on the foundation of an empire's wealth, where art and cruelty danced together in the flickering light of 10,000 oil lamps. The emperor himself moved through these gardens with the fluid grace of a performer, his toga arranged in folds that would have made a sculptor weep with envy, his golden hair catching the lamplight like spun sunbeams. He paused beside a fountain carved from a single block of Parian marble, its waters reflecting the stars that seemed to shine more brightly over the golden house than anywhere else in the world. This was the palace he had built for himself, a monument to imperial ambition that covered a third of Rome and contained wonders that would have made the pharaohs of Egypt grow pale with envy. But even in this paradise of his own creation, even surrounded by beauty that mortal eyes had never before beheld, Nero felt the weight of dissatisfaction pressing down upon his shoulders like a mantle made of lead. The empire was vast, stretching from the mists of Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the forests of Germany to the deserts of Arabia. Yet somehow it felt too small, too confining, too ordinary for a man who had been born to be a god among mortals. The lute waited for him in the garden's heart, its strings tuned to perfection by the finest musicians in the world, its body carved from wood that had grown in groves sacred to Apollo himself. Nero lifted the instrument with reverence, feeling its familiar weight in his hands, and began to play melodies that seemed to make the very air shimmer with ethereal beauty. He was, in his own mind, the greatest artist who had ever lived, a musician whose talents surpassed even the gods themselves. The music floated across the garden like incense rising toward heaven, each note perfect and precisely placed, each phrase a masterpiece of artistic expression. The courtiers who gathered to listen wore expressions of rapture that might have been genuine or might have been the practiced faces of men who had learned that an emperor's art must always be applauded, that criticism of the imperial performance was a form of treason punishable by death. But while Nero played his lute in the perfumed gardens of the Golden House, while his music rose toward the indifferent stars, a different kind of performance was beginning in the streets of Rome. The fire started small, as such disasters often do, a single spark in a shop near the Circus Maximus, a flicker of flame that seemed no more significant than the oil lamps that lit the city's nights. But Rome was a city built of wood and thatch, of narrow streets and crowded tenements, and fire, once started, had a way of writing its own story. The flames spread with the hunger of a living thing, leaping from building to building, from street to street, consuming everything in their path with an appetite that seemed to grow with feeding. The wooden shops burst into torches, the apartment buildings became pillars of fire, and the narrow alleys filled with smoke that turned the Roman night into a vision of hell itself. The citizens fled before the advancing flames like leaves scattered by an autumn wind, carrying what they could save and abandoning what they could not. The emperor's response to the crisis became the stuff of legend, though whether the legend was true or false would be debated by historians for centuries to come. Some said he watched the fire from his palace walls, playing his lute while Rome burned, composing verses about the fall of Troy while his own city turned to ash. Others claimed he was away from the city when the fire began, that he rushed back to organize relief efforts, that he opened his own palace to shelter the homeless and spent his personal fortune on rebuilding efforts. But legends, like fires, have a way of consuming truth, and the story that survived was the one that fit the character people had come to expect from their emperor. Nero the artist, Nero the performer, Nero the man who had confused ruling with entertaining, governing with gesture, power with the ability to command applause. Whether he actually played while Rome burned mattered less than the fact that people believed he would, that such behavior seemed perfectly consistent with everything they knew about their imperial actor. The fire burned for 6 days and 7 nights, consuming 3 of Rome's 14 districts, completely, and damaging 7 others beyond easy repair. When the flames finally died, when the smoke cleared and the sun rose on a city transformed into a landscape of ash and rubble, the empire had been changed forever, not by conquest or plague or natural disaster, but by the simple truth that a city made of wood will burn, and that even the greatest empires are only as strong as the trust between ruler and ruled. The rebuilding efforts that followed were magnificent in scale and ambition, a testament to Roman engineering and imperial wealth. Nero decreed that the new Rome would be built of stone and brick, that the streets would be wider, that the buildings would be safer and more beautiful than anything the world had ever seen. He drew up plans for a city that would be a work of art in itself, a living sculpture that would demonstrate the glory of his reign to future generations. But rebuilding requires more than vision and ambition. It requires money, vast amounts of money, more money than even the Roman treasury could easily provide. The emperor's response was to squeeze his subjects like grapes in a winepress, to impose taxes that would have made his predecessors blanch with horror, to confiscate property and demand tribute with the casual cruelty of a man who had forgotten that empires are built on the consent of the governed. The treason trials began as whispers in the Senate, as careful conversations between men who had learned to speak in code when the emperor was listening. But whispers have a way of becoming rumors, and rumors have a way of becoming accusations, and accusations have a way of becoming death sentences when the accused are wealthy enough to solve an emperor's financial problems. The great families of Rome began to disappear one by one, their wealth flowing into the imperial treasury, their names erased from the records as if they had never existed. Gaius Calpurnius Piso was among the first to understand that wealth had become a crime punishable by death, that success had become a form of treason, that the only safety lay in removing the source of danger. The conspiracy that formed around him was not driven by ideology or patriotism, but by the simple desire to survive, to preserve something of the old Rome before the emperor's artistic vision consumed what remained of the Republic's traditions. The plot was discovered, as such plots usually are, through the weakness of one conspirator and the efficiency of the imperial spy network. The trials that followed were magnificent spectacles of imperial justice, carefully choreographed performances in which the emperor played the role of the merciful ruler, reluctantly forced to punish those who had betrayed his trust. The sentences were death, as they always were, but the condemned were sometimes granted the privilege of choosing their own manner of dying. Seneca, the philosopher, Nero's old tutor and advisor, opened his veins in a warm bath, his life flowing away like water down a drain, while he dictated final thoughts to his secretary. Petronius the Elegant, author of the Satyricon, chose poison administered at a dinner party, transforming his death into a final work of art. Lucan, the poet, nephew of Seneca, recited verses from his own epic about the civil war, as his blood pooled on the marble floor of his villa. But the deaths of the conspirators, rather than strengthening Nero's position, only demonstrated how isolated he had become, how completely he had severed the bonds that connected ruler to ruled. The Senate that had once cheered his performances now watched him with the hollow-eyed attention of men who had learned that survival required applause, but that applause could not create genuine loyalty. The military legions, those backbone of Roman power, began to stir with the restlessness of professional soldiers who had grown tired of serving an emperor who seemed more interested in artistic pursuits than in the practical business of governing an empire. The governors of distant provinces, men who commanded armies and controlled vast territories, began to wonder why they should continue to send tribute to a ruler who had lost the confidence of his own capital. The rebellion, when it came, started in Gaul, where Gaius Julius Vindex raised the standard of revolt, not against Rome, but against Nero personally. The message was clear. The empire could survive without its emperor, but the emperor could not survive without his empire. The contagion spread quickly, from province to province, from legion to legion, as commanders who had served Rome faithfully for decades declared that their loyalty was to the state rather than to the man who happened to wear the purple. Galba in Spain, Otho in Lusitania, Vitellius in Germania. One by one, the provincial governors declared their independence from an emperor who had forfeited the right to rule. The Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers who were supposed to protect the emperor's person, began to waver as they calculated the odds of survival in a civil war that seemed to have only one possible outcome. The end came, not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet efficiency of men who had decided that their emperor had become a liability they could no longer afford. The palace that had once seemed like paradise now felt like a prison, its beautiful gardens becoming a trap for a man who had forgotten that even gods need worshippers to survive. The courtiers who had once competed for imperial favor now avoided the emperor's presence, afraid that association with him might prove fatal when the reckoning came. Nero's flight from Rome was undignified, desperate, the panicked escape of a man who had suddenly realized that the performance was over and the audience had gone home. He sought shelter in a villa belonging to one of his freedmen, a modest house that must have seemed like a hovel after the splendors of the Golden House. Here, in a simple room lit by a single oil lamp, the emperor who had dreamed of being remembered as the greatest artist who ever lived faced the reality of his situation. The sound of approaching horses echoed through the night like distant thunder, carrying with it the promise of capture, trial, and execution. Nero had seen enough of his own justice to know what awaited him, had witnessed enough of his own spectacles to understand that he was about to become the main attraction in a performance he had not scripted and could not control. The suicide, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, the final act of a man who had learned too late that life is not a stage play and that some performances have consequences that extend beyond the theater. The emperor placed the blade against his throat with trembling hands, spoke his final words to the empty air. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist perishes in me. And then completed the last performance of his career with a gesture that was both theatrical and final. The silence that followed was profound, like the hush that falls over a theater when the curtain comes down and the audience realizes that the play is over. The Golden House still gleamed in the Roman night, its gardens still perfumed, its fountains still singing their crystal songs. But the emperor was gone, and with him an age of Roman history that had confused spectacle with government, performance with power, the ability to command applause with the wisdom to inspire genuine loyalty. The empire survived, as empires sometimes do, finding new role COMMODUS. The arena sand drank blood like a thirsty god, its golden surface stained with the crimson offerings of gladiators who had died for the entertainment of an emperor who had forgotten that ruling and performing were different arts, requiring different skills. The torches burned with a steady flame around the Colosseum's rim, their light painting the marble seats in shades of amber and shadow, while the crowd roared its approval of yet another spectacular death. This was Rome in the reign of Commodus, a city that had learned to mistake spectacle for governance, entertainment for leadership, the ability to kill for the wisdom to rule. The emperor himself stood in the imperial box, his muscular frame gleaming with oil and sweat, his golden hair crowned with a laurel wreath that proclaimed his victory over yet another carefully selected opponent. He had just strangled a lion with his bare hands, or so the official account would record, though those who watched closely might have noticed that the beast had seemed unusually docile, that its claws had been filed down, that its movements had the sluggish quality of an animal that had been drugged into submission. But the crowd saw what it wanted to see, and what it wanted to see was a god among men, a ruler who possessed not just political power, but physical prowess, who could dominate not just senators and governors, but the very beasts of the arena. Commodus had learned early in his reign that the Roman people would forgive almost any excess, excuse almost any cruelty, overlook almost any incompetence, as long as they were entertained. Bread and circuses, as the satirists said, were all that the mob required to remain docile. The young emperor had not always been a monster. There had been a time, in the early days of his reign, when he had shown promise of becoming a worthy successor to his father, the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius. The Stoic virtues had been drummed into him from childhood, the lessons of duty and service, and the subordination of personal desire to the common good. But philosophy, as Commodus had discovered, was a cold comfort when compared to the warm embrace of absolute power and the intoxicating roar of an adoring crowd. The transformation had been gradual, like the slow corruption of fruit left too long in the sun. The administrative duties that had once seemed manageable became tedious, then burdensome, then impossible to bear. The careful balance of senatorial privilege and imperial authority that had maintained peace for generations began to seem like an unnecessary constraint on imperial will. The philosophical discussions that had once stimulated his mind now felt like the droning of insects, irritating and pointless. It was so much easier to delegate the boring business of government to others, to let the Praetorian prefects handle the tedious details of administration, while the emperor pursued more interesting diversions. The gladiatorial schools of Rome offered training in the arts of combat, the opportunity to test oneself against professional fighters, the chance to experience the pure thrill of violence without the messy complications of political consequence. The people loved it, or at least they seemed to love it. The crowds that gathered to watch their emperor fight grew larger with each performance, their cheers louder, their enthusiasm more frenzied. Commodus began to schedule more and more appearances in the arena, sometimes fighting multiple opponents in a single day, always emerging victorious through a combination of superior training, carefully chosen adversaries, and the simple fact that no gladiator was foolish enough to harm the man who signed his death warrant. But while the emperor played at being a gladiator, while the crowds cheered his staged victories and marveled at his choreographed courage, the empire itself began to show signs of the neglect that comes when rulers confuse entertainment with governance. The grain supplies that kept Rome fed became irregular. The public works that kept the city functioning fell into disrepair. The military campaigns that secured the borders were postponed or abandoned altogether. The plague had come to Rome like a thief in the night, creeping through the crowded tenements and spreading with the relentless efficiency of a well-organized army. It struck the poor first, as such disasters always do, killing the slaves and freedmen who had no resources to flee to healthier climates. But disease, unlike human enemies, recognizes no social boundaries, and soon the great houses of the Palatine Hill began to empty as their inhabitants succumbed to the same fever that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens. The emperor's response to the crisis was to increase the number of gladiatorial games, to provide more spectacular entertainments, to distract the survivors from their suffering with ever more elaborate displays of violence and excess. The logic was simple. If the people were dying anyway, at least they could die entertained. If the empire was collapsing, at least it could collapse with style. The grain prices rose like flood waters, climbing beyond the reach of ordinary citizens who had once taken cheap bread for granted. The bakeries that had fed the city for generations began to close their doors, their ovens cold, their shelves empty. The food riots that followed were put down with the same casual brutality that the emperor displayed in the arena, the same choreographed violence that had once seemed so entertaining when applied to gladiators and wild beasts. But the most visible symbol of imperial excess was the emperor himself, who had begun to demand worship not just as a ruler, but as a god, not just as a man, but as the literal incarnation of Hercules himself. The statues that appeared throughout the city showed Commodus dressed as the hero of legend, his face bearing the features of the emperor but his body displaying the muscled perfection of divine strength. The months of the year were renamed in his honor. The city itself was briefly called Colonia Commodiana, and the Senate was forced to acclaim him as the Roman Hercules in ceremonies that would have been laughable if they had not been so terrifying. The administrators who actually ran the empire while the emperor played in the arena were themselves symptoms of the disease that had infected the Roman system. Cleander, the Syrian freedman who served as Commodus's chief minister, had turned corruption into an art form, selling offices, commands, and even consulships to the highest bidder. The ancient traditions of Roman service, the ideal of public duty that had built the empire, were auctioned off like goods in a marketplace. The senators who had once prided themselves on their dignity and their service to the state now competed to bid on positions that their ancestors had held as a sacred trust. The consulship, that highest of republican offices, was sold so frequently that some years saw 25 different men hold the title. The very concept of public service had been transformed into a business transaction, and the business was booming. But even in a system corrupted by greed and debased by spectacle, there were limits to what people would endure. The Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers who were supposed to protect the emperor's person, began to murmur among themselves about the difference between a ruler and a tyrant, between an emperor and a madman. The officers who commanded the legions on the distant frontiers started to question whether their loyalty was owed to the man who wore the purple or to the state that the purple was supposed to represent. The conspiracy that formed around Commodus was not driven by ideology or patriotism, but by the simple desire to survive, to preserve something of the old Rome before the emperor's madness consumed what remained of the empire's strength. The plotters included his own sister Lucilla, who had grown tired of watching her brother destroy everything their father had built. They included senators who remembered when that body had been more than a ceremonial appendage to imperial will. They included Praetorian officers who had sworn to protect the emperor, but had come to believe that protecting him meant protecting the empire from him. The end came in the baths, in the steam-filled chambers, where the emperor went to relax after his performances in the arena. The assassin was Narcissus, a professional athlete who had been hired to serve as Commodus's wrestling partner, a man whose powerful hands had learned to give pleasure through massage and death through strangulation. The emperor died as he had lived, in a performance, though this time he was not the star but the victim, not the entertainer, but the entertainment. The Senate's response was swift and absolute, a declaration of damnatio memoria that would erase Commodus from official history as completely as if he had never existed. His statues were torn down, his inscriptions were chiseled away, his name was removed from the monuments and buildings that had once proclaimed his glory. The month that had been named Commodius was renamed. The city that had briefly been called Colonia Commodiana became Rome again. And the empire tried to forget that it had ever been ruled by a man who had confused performance with power. But forgetting, like remembering, is a choice that requires constant effort, and the memory of Commodus lingered like smoke from a fire that had been hastily extinguished. The empire that emerged from his reign was different, changed by the experience of being ruled by a man who had treated the business of government like a gladiatorial game, who had confused the ability to kill with the wisdom to rule, who had believed that being emperor was the same as being entertained. The reforms that followed were necessary but insufficient, attempts to repair damage that went deeper than law or custom could reach. The system that had produced Marcus Aurelius the philosopher had also produced Commodus the gladiator, and there was no guarantee that it would not produce others like him. The empire was vast and rich and powerful, but it was also fragile in ways that its citizens were only beginning to understand. The arena sand was cleaned and fresh sand was spread, ready for new games and new entertainments. The lions were fed and trained, the gladiators practiced their skills, the crowds gathered to watch other men die for their amusement. But something had changed in the relationship between ruler and ruled. Some understanding of the limits of power and the responsibilities of leadership that would take generations to recover, if it ever could be recovered at all. The wind blew through the empty corridors of the palace, stirring the dust that had once been imperial dreams, carrying with it the scent of a city that had learned to live without gods who walked among men. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of cheers that had once seemed genuine, but now sounded hollow, the ghost of applause that had once seemed deserved but now felt forced, the memory of a man who had confused the ability to command attention with the wisdom to deserve it. The empire endured, as empires sometimes do, finding new rulers and new purposes, learning to live without the man who had believed that being emperor was the same as being a performer, that governing was the same as entertaining, that the love of subjects could be earned through spectacle rather than through service. But the lesson had been learned, even if it had been learned too late. that some performances have consequences that extend beyond the theatre, and that the most dangerous rulers are often those who forget that they are ruling real people rather than entertaining an audience. And new purposes, learning to live without the man who had believed that being emperor was the same as being an artist, that governing was the same as performing, that the love of subjects could be earned through spectacle rather than through service. But something had been lost in the transition, some understanding of the relationship between ruler and ruled that would take generations to recover, if it ever could be recovered at all. The wind blew through the abandoned gardens of the Domus Aurea, rustling the leaves of trees that had been planted to please an emperor's eye, stirring the waters of fountains that had been built to soothe an emperor's ear. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of music that had once seemed beautiful, but now sounded hollow, the ghost of applause that had once seemed sincere, but now felt forced, the memory of a man who had confused the ability to command attention with the wisdom to deserve it. COMMODUS. The arena sand drank blood like a thirsty god, its golden surface stained with the crimson offerings of gladiators who had died for the entertainment of an emperor, who had forgotten that ruling and performing were different arts, requiring different skills. The torches burned with a steady flame around the Colosseum's rim, their light painting the marble seats in shades of amber and shadow, while the crowd roared its approval of yet another spectacular death. This was Rome in the reign of Commodus, a city that had learned to mistake spectacle for governance, entertainment for leadership, the ability to kill for the wisdom to rule. The emperor himself stood in the imperial box, his muscular frame gleaming with oil and sweat, his golden hair crowned with a laurel wreath that proclaimed his victory over yet another carefully selected opponent. He had just strangled a lion with his bare hands, or so the official account would record, though those who watched closely might have noticed that the beast had seemed unusually docile, that its claws had been filed down, that its movements had the sluggish quality of an animal that had been drugged into submission. But the crowd saw what it wanted to see, and what it wanted to see was a god among men, a ruler who possessed not just political power, but physical prowess, who could dominate not just senators and governors, but the very beasts of the arena. Commodus had learned early in his reign that the Roman people would forgive almost any excess, excuse almost any cruelty, overlook almost any incompetence, as long as they were entertained. Bread and circuses, as the satirists said, were all that the mob required to remain docile. The young emperor had not always been a monster. There had been a time, in the early days of his reign, when he had shown promise of becoming a worthy successor to his father, the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius. The Stoic virtues had been drummed into him from childhood, the lessons of duty and service, and the subordination of personal desire to the common good. But philosophy, as Commodus had discovered, was a cold comfort when compared to the warm embrace of absolute power and the intoxicating roar of an adoring crowd. The transformation had been gradual, like the slow corruption of fruit left too long in the sun. The administrative duties that had once seemed manageable became tedious, then burdensome, then impossible to bear. The careful balance of senatorial privilege and imperial authority that had maintained peace for generations began to seem like an unnecessary constraint on imperial will. The philosophical discussions that had once stimulated his mind now felt like the droning of insects, irritating and pointless. It was so much easier to delegate the boring business of government to others, to let the praetorian prefects handle the tedious details of administration, while the emperor pursued more interesting diversions. The gladiatorial schools of Rome offered training in the arts of combat, the opportunity to test oneself against professional fighters, the chance to experience the pure thrill of violence without the messy complications of political consequence. The people loved it, or at least they seemed to love it. The crowds that gathered to watch their emperor fight grew larger with each performance, their cheers louder, their enthusiasm more frenzied. Commodus began to schedule more and more appearances in the arena, sometimes fighting multiple opponents in a single day, always emerging victorious through a combination of superior training, carefully chosen adversaries, and the simple fact that no gladiator was foolish enough to harm the man who signed his death warrant. But while the emperor played at being a gladiator, while the crowds cheered his staged victories and marveled at his choreographed courage, the empire itself began to show signs of the neglect that comes when rulers confuse entertainment with governance. The grain supplies that kept Rome fed became irregular. The public works that kept the city functioning fell into disrepair. The military campaigns that secured the borders were postponed or abandoned altogether. The plague had come to Rome like a thief in the night, creeping through the crowded tenements and spreading with the relentless efficiency of a well-organized army. It struck the poor first, as such disasters always do, killing the slaves and freedmen who had no resources to flee to healthier climates. But disease, unlike human enemies, recognizes no social boundaries, and soon the great houses of the Palatine Hill began to empty as their inhabitants succumbed to the same fever that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens. The emperor's response to the crisis was to increase the number of gladiatorial games, to provide more spectacular entertainments, to distract the survivors from their suffering with ever more elaborate displays of violence and excess. The logic was simple. If the people were dying anyway, at least they could die entertained. If the empire was collapsing, at least it could collapse with style. The grain prices rose like flood waters, climbing beyond the reach of ordinary citizens who had once taken cheap bread for granted. The bakeries that had fed the city for generations began to close their doors, their ovens cold, their shelves empty. The food riots that followed were put down with the same casual brutality that the emperor displayed in the arena, the same choreographed violence that had once seemed so entertaining when applied to gladiators and wild beasts. But the most visible symbol of imperial excess was the emperor himself, who had begun to demand worship not just as a ruler but as a god, not just as a man but as the literal incarnation of Hercules himself. The statues that appeared throughout the city showed Commodus dressed as the hero of legend, his face bearing the features of the emperor but his body displaying the muscled perfection of divine strength. The months of the year were renamed in his honor. The city itself was briefly called Colonia Commodiana, and the Senate was forced to acclaim him as the Roman Hercules in ceremonies that would have been laughable if they had not been so terrifying. The administrators who actually ran the empire while the emperor played in the arena were themselves symptoms of the disease that had infected the Roman system. Cleander, the Syrian freedman who served as Commodus's chief minister, had turned corruption into an art form, selling offices, commands, and even consulships to the highest bidder. The ancient traditions of Roman service, the ideal of public duty that had built the empire, were auctioned off like goods in a marketplace. The senators who had once prided themselves on their dignity and their service to the state now competed to bid on positions that their ancestors had held as a sacred trust. The consulship, that highest of republican offices, was sold so frequently that some years saw 25 different men hold the title. The very concept of public service had been transformed into a business transaction, and the business was booming. But even in a system corrupted by greed and debased by spectacle, there were limits to what people would endure. The Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers who were supposed to protect the emperor's person, began to murmur among themselves about the difference between a ruler and a tyrant, between an emperor and a madman. The officers who commanded the legions on the distant frontiers started to question whether their loyalty was owed to the man who wore the purple or to the state that the purple was supposed to represent. The conspiracy that formed around Commodus was not driven by ideology or patriotism but by the simple desire to survive, to preserve something of the old Rome before the emperor's madness consumed what remained of the empire's strength. The plotters included his own sister Lucilla, who had grown tired of watching her brother destroy everything their father had built. They included senators who remembered when that body had been more than a ceremonial appendage to imperial will. They included Praetorian officers who had sworn to protect the emperor, but had come to believe that protecting him meant protecting the empire from him. The end came in the baths, in the steam-filled chambers where the emperor went to relax after his performances in the arena. The assassin was Narcissus, a professional athlete who had been hired to serve as Commodus's wrestling partner, a man whose powerful hands had learned to give pleasure through massage and death through strangulation. The emperor died as he had lived, in a performance, though this time he was not the star but the victim, not the entertainer, but the entertainment. The Senate's response was swift and absolute, a declaration of damnatio memoriae that would erase Commodus from official history as completely as if he had never existed. His statues were torn down, his inscriptions were chiseled away, his name was removed from the monuments and buildings that had once proclaimed his glory. The month that had been named Commodus was renamed. The city that had briefly been called Colonia Commodiana became Rome again, and the empire tried to forget that it had ever been ruled by a man who had confused performance with power. But forgetting, like remembering, is a choice that requires constant effort, and the memory of Commodus lingered like smoke from a fire that had been hastily extinguished. The empire that emerged from his reign was different, changed by the experience of being ruled by a man who had treated the business of government like a gladiatorial game, who had confused the ability to kill with the wisdom to rule, who had believed that being emperor was the same as being entertained. The reforms that followed were necessary, but insufficient, attempts to repair damage that went deeper than law or custom could reach. The system that had produced Marcus Aurelius the philosopher had also produced Commodus the gladiator, and there was no guarantee that it would not produce others like him. The empire was vast and rich and powerful, but it was also fragile in ways that its citizens were only beginning to understand. The arena sand was cleaned and fresh sand was spread, ready for new games and new entertainments. The lions were fed and trained, the gladiators practiced their skills, the crowds gathered to watch other men die for their amusement. But something had changed in the relationship between ruler and ruled, some understanding of the limits of power and the responsibilities of leadership that would take generations to recover, if it ever could be recovered at all. The wind blew through the empty corridors of the palace, stirring the dust that had once been imperial dreams, carrying with it the scent of a city that had learned to live without gods who walked among men. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of cheers that had once seemed genuine, but now sounded hollow, the ghost of applause that had once seemed deserved but now felt forced, the memory of a man who had confused the ability to command attention with the wisdom to deserve it. The empire endured, as empires sometimes do, finding new rulers and new purposes, learning to live without the man who had believed that being emperor was the same as being a performer, that governing was the same as entertaining, that the love of subjects could be earned through spectacle rather than through service. But the lesson had been learned, even if it had been learned too late, that some performances have consequences that extend beyond the theatre, and that the most dangerous rulers are often those who forget that they are ruling real people rather than entertaining an audience. Romulus, Augustulus. The rain fell on Ravenna like the tears of a dying god, each drop carrying with it the weight of 5 centuries of imperial ambition, now dissolving into the grey twilight of a world that had forgotten how to be Roman. The marble corridors of the palace echoed with the sound of footsteps that grew fewer each day, the hollow percussion of a boy's sandals on stones that had once trembled beneath the boots of emperors who commanded legions and conquered nations. This was the autumn of empire, the season when the leaves fall and the earth prepares for winter, when the old world dies and the new world struggles to be born. Romulus Augustulus sat on the throne of the West, though throne was perhaps too grand a word for the chair that had been salvaged from the wreckage of a collapsing civilization. He was 16 years old, with the smooth face of a child and the solemn eyes of someone who had learned too early that titles are just words and that crowns are just metal circles that grow heavy when worn by heads too young to bear their weight. His name was a cruel joke played by fate. Romulus, after the founder of Rome, and Augustulus, the little Augustus, a diminutive that mocked the very concept of imperial majesty. The empire he had inherited was not the mighty realm that had once stretched from the mists of Scotland to the sands of the Sahara, but a fragmentary thing, a collection of cities and territories that called themselves Roman, but were Roman only in the sense that ghosts are the people they once were. The real power lay with the barbarian foederati, those Germanic warriors who had been invited into the empire as allies and had stayed as masters, who fought Rome's battles and collected Rome's taxes and obeyed Rome's laws only when it suited their purposes. Odoacer stood in the palace courtyard, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, his scarred hands resting on the pommel of a sword that had tasted the blood of a dozen battlefields. He was Assyrian, one of those Germanic peoples who had learned to speak Latin and wear Roman clothes, but who had never forgotten that they were conquerors in a conquered land. His men surrounded him like a pack of wolves, their eyes reflecting the grey light of the overcast sky, their silence more threatening than any spoken threat could have been. The boy emperor watched from his window as the barbarian king approached, knowing that this moment had been inevitable, that the last act of the Roman tragedy was finally about to be performed. There would be no dramatic speeches, no clash of arms, no heroic last stand. The Western Roman Empire would end as it had lived in its final years, with a whimper rather than a roar, with resignation rather than resistance, with the quiet acceptance of a reality that had been too long in coming. The negotiation, if it could be called that, was brief and civilized, conducted with the kind of polite courtesy that civilized men use when discussing the transfer of power between generations. Odoacer had come not as a conqueror, but as a practical administrator, a man who understood that running an empire required skills that were independent of the accident of birth or the mythology of divine appointment. He had no use for the title of emperor, no desire to claim the purple or to pretend that he was the inheritor of Augustus and Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. Instead, he proposed a different arrangement, one that would acknowledge the reality of power while preserving the fiction of continuity. He would rule as the King of Italy, sending the imperial regalia back to Constantinople, where the Eastern Emperor could maintain the pretense of Roman unity. Young Romulus would be pensioned off, given a villa in Campania and an income sufficient to maintain the dignity of his station, allowed to live out his days in comfortable obscurity while history moved on without him. The ceremony of abdication was conducted with the same attention to protocol that had marked every imperial transition since the days of Augustus, though everyone present understood that this transition was different, that something essential was ending, even as the forms were preserved. The boy emperor removed his purple cloak with hands that barely trembled, placed his crown on the table with the careful precision of someone performing a ritual that had been rehearsed but never quite believed. The diadem that had adorned the heads of Caesar and Augustus, of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, of Constantine and Theodosius, was now just a circle of gold and gems, waiting to be shipped eastward to a city that called itself the New Rome. The symbols of power were packed away like props from a finished play, the scepter and the orb, the seals and the standards, the ceremonial weapons that had represented the empire's authority over its subjects and its enemies. Each item was wrapped in silk and placed in wooden boxes that would travel the long road to Constantinople, carrying with them the last tangible remnants of the Western Empire's claim to legitimacy. But the most significant transfer was not of objects, but of responsibility, not of symbols, but of the burden of governing a fractured and exhausted land. Odoacer accepted this burden with the grim satisfaction of a man who had earned his authority through competence rather than inheritance, who understood that power was not a privilege to be enjoyed, but a duty to be discharged. He was not a Roman, but he might prove to be a better ruler than the Romans had produced in generations. The journey to Campania was a melancholy pilgrimage through a landscape that bore the scars of a century of decline. The roads that had once carried the legions of Rome now showed the neglect of an empire that could no longer maintain the infrastructure that had made it great. The cities that had once been centers of trade and culture now stood half empty, their forums overgrown with weeds, their aqueducts broken, their theaters dark and silent. The villa that would be Romulus's home was a pleasant enough place, with gardens that overlooked the Bay of Naples and rooms that caught the morning sun. It had been built for some forgotten senator in the days when Rome was still the center of the world, when the empire seemed as permanent as the mountains and as eternal as the sea. Now it would house the last emperor of the West, a boy who had ruled for less than a year, and would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what had happened to the world he had been born to inherit. The routine of exile was comfortable but empty, filled with the small pleasures that make life bearable but cannot make it meaningful. There were books to read, letters to write, gardens to tend, and servants to supervise. The income that Odoacer provided was sufficient to maintain a modest household, to dress well and eat well and live with the kind of dignity that befitted a former emperor. But there was no purpose to any of it, no sense that any of these activities mattered or that the world would be different if they were performed well or badly. The reports that reached the villa spoke of a world that was changing with bewildering speed, adapting to the new reality of barbarian rule with the resilience that had always been Rome's greatest strength. The Senate still met, though it now advised a Germanic king rather than a Roman emperor. The law courts still functioned, though they now interpreted the commands of men who had learned Latin as a foreign language. The taxes were still collected, though they now filled the treasuries of kingdoms rather than the empire. And slowly, gradually, the very concept of Rome began to transform itself, to become something different from what it had been. The city remained, the name endured, the memory persisted, but the reality had changed beyond recognition. Rome was no longer the capital of an empire but the seat of a papacy, no longer the center of a political system but the heart of a spiritual one. The emperors were gone, but the bishops remained, and with them a different kind of authority, a different kind of power, a different kind of promise to the world. The years passed quietly in the villa by the bay, marked by the changing seasons and the gradual accumulation of small defeats that make up the texture of ordinary life. Romulus grew from a boy into a young man, from a young man into someone who was no longer young, watching the world change around him while he remained fixed in the amber of his own irrelevance. He had been the last emperor of the West, but he was also the first to live entirely as a private citizen, the first to discover what it meant to be Roman without being imperial. The letters that arrived from Constantinople spoke of an Eastern Empire that continued to call itself Roman, but was becoming something increasingly Byzantine, increasingly Greek, increasingly distant from the Latin world that had given birth to the imperial idea. The emperor in the new Rome still claimed authority over the West, but it was a claim that no one took seriously, a legal fiction that satisfied the requirements of continuity while acknowledging the reality of separation. The death of Romulus Augustulus was as quiet as his life had been, as unremarkable as the end of empires often is, when they die not from violence, but from exhaustion, not from conquest, but from the simple recognition that their time has passed. He was buried in the villa's garden, beneath a simple stone that bore his name and the years of his birth and death, but made no mention of the title he had briefly held or the empire he had briefly represented. The Western Roman Empire had ended not with the clash of armies or the fall of cities, but with the quiet surrender of a boy who had understood that some burdens are too heavy for any individual to bear, that some responsibilities are too great for any single person to discharge. The empire had lasted for 5 centuries, had conquered most of the known world, had created laws and institutions that would endure for millennia after its political structures had crumbled into dust. But in the end, it had been brought down not by its enemies but by its own contradictions. not by the strength of barbarians, but by the weakness of Romans, not by the failure of its armies, but by the failure of its imagination. The empire that had once believed itself eternal had learned that nothing under heaven lasts forever, that even the mightiest civilizations are subject to the same laws of growth and decay that govern all living things. The rain continued to fall on Ravenna, washing away the last traces of imperial presence, carrying toward the sea the dissolved dreams of 1,000 years of Roman ambition. And in that rain, if you listened carefully, you could hear the whisper of change, the sound of one world ending and another beginning, the echo of a story that had been told to its conclusion and would soon be forgotten in favor of new stories, new dreams, new empires that would rise and fall in their own time and their own way. The boy emperor was dead, but the empire had died before him, and the world had already moved on to other concerns, other possibilities, other ways of organizing human civilization. The last emperor of the West had learned the final lesson of imperial power, that it is not the rulers who make history, but history that makes the rulers, and that the greatest empires are often those that know when to step aside and let the future unfold according to its own mysterious logic. Emperor Yang of Sui. The moon hung like a silver coin above the Grand Canal, its light rippling across waters that had been carved from the earth by the hands of 1,000,000 peasants. Each drop of sweat and each spilled tear now transformed into something that would outlast the dynasty that had commanded its creation. The imperial barges drifted through the night, like floating palaces, their silk screens glowing with the warm light of oil lamps, their hulls cutting through water that connected the Yellow River to the Yangtze, the north to the south, the past to a future that seemed bright with possibility. Emperor Yang of Sui reclined on cushions of the finest silk, watching the landscape slide past like scenes from a painted scroll, feeling the gentle motion of the barge as it carried him toward Yangzhou and the southern reaches of his empire. The canal was his masterpiece, the achievement that would make his name immortal, a waterway that would serve China for 1,000 years and prove that human will could reshape even the fundamental geography of the world. But tonight, as the emperor watched the moon's reflection fracture and reform in the wake of his passage, he felt the weight of accomplishment pressing down upon him like a golden chain. The empire he had inherited from his father was already the largest and richest in the world, stretching from the steppes of Mongolia to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of the West to the shores of the Eastern Sea. The Sui dynasty had reunified China after centuries of division, had rebuilt the Great Wall, had created a system of government that functioned with the precision of a water clock. But for Yang, inheritance was not enough. He had been born to surpass his father, to write his name in characters of gold across the scroll of history, to prove that the second emperor of a dynasty could eclipse the founder himself. The Grand Canal was only the beginning, the first stroke of a brush that would paint the world in the colors of imperial ambition. The waterway stretched for over 1,000 miles, connecting the rice-producing south with the population centers of the north, creating a commercial artery that would pump wealth and resources through the body of the empire, like blood through living tissue. The cost had been enormous, measured not just in silver and gold, but in the lives of the peasants who had dug the channel with their bare hands, who had died by the thousands from exhaustion and disease, and the simple grinding horror of labor without end. But what were the lives of peasants compared to the immortal glory of imperial achievement? The emperor had been taught by the greatest scholars of his age that rulers were the sons of heaven, that their will was the will of the gods themselves, that ordinary humans existed primarily to serve the greater purposes of those who had been born to command. The canal would serve China for generations, would make the empire stronger and richer and more unified than ever before. Such achievements required sacrifice, and sacrifice, by definition, was something that others provided for the glory of their betters. The Korean campaigns had seemed like a natural extension of this logic, a logical next step in the expansion of Chinese power and influence. Goguryeo, the northern Korean kingdom, had grown too strong, too independent, too willing to challenge the supremacy of the Middle Kingdom. The emperor's armies had crossed the frozen Yalu River like a tide of steel and silk, their banners snapping in the bitter wind, their confidence as solid as the ice beneath their feet. But Korea was not China, and the Goguryeo warriors were not peasants to be conscripted and worked to death. They were professional soldiers who had been fighting the Chinese for generations, who knew every mountain pass and forest path, who understood that survival sometimes required the kind of desperate courage that turns ordinary men into heroes. The Chinese armies, magnificent in their silk and bronze, found themselves trapped in a landscape that seemed designed to kill invaders. The winter was cruel beyond imagining, the kind of cold that turns spit to ice before it hits the ground, that makes steel as brittle as pottery and turns human flesh into something that shatters at a touch. The supply lines that had seemed so secure in the warmth of the Chinese summer now stretched across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness, vulnerable to raiders who struck like ghosts and vanished like smoke. The soldiers who had marched north with songs on their lips now huddled around inadequate fires, their breath forming clouds that seemed to mock their dreams of easy conquest. The first campaign failed, as such campaigns often do, not through any single disaster, but through the accumulation of small defeats that add up to strategic catastrophe. The emperor's response was to plan a second campaign, then a third, then a fourth, each one larger and more expensive than the last, each one draining the empire's resources like a wound that would not heal. The peasants who had built the Grand Canal now found themselves conscripted to fight in wars they did not understand, in a land they had never seen, for purposes that seemed increasingly divorced from their own welfare. The palace in Yangzhou had become Yang's refuge from the increasingly grim news that arrived from the northern fronts. Here, surrounded by gardens that bloomed with flowers from every corner of the empire, served by courtiers who competed to praise his wisdom and foresight, the emperor could maintain the illusion that his campaigns were succeeding, that Korea would soon bow before Chinese power, that the temporary setbacks were merely the price of ultimate victory. The palace itself was a marvel of architecture and engineering, its halls decorated with paintings that depicted the emperor's triumphs in colors that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The ceiling of the throne room was painted to resemble the night sky, with stars made of precious stones that caught the lamplight and threw back rainbow reflections. The floors were inlaid with patterns of ivory and jade that told the story of the dynasty's rise to power, while the walls were covered with silk tapestries that showed the emperor receiving tribute from grateful subjects. But even in this paradise of imperial luxury, even surrounded by beauty that mortal eyes had seldom beheld, Yang felt the weight of dissatisfaction pressing down upon his shoulders like a robe made of lead. The reports from Korea grew more discouraging with each passing month, the cost of the campaigns more ruinous, the mood of the people more dangerous. The empire that had seemed so solid and permanent was beginning to show signs of the strain that comes when ambition exceeds resources, when dreams grow larger than the capacity to fulfill them. The tax collectors who rode out from the capital now carried not just the authority of the emperor, but the desperation of a government that had spent beyond its means. The peasants who had already sacrificed their sons to build the canal now found themselves required to provide the silver and grain that would feed the armies fighting in Korea. The merchants who had grown rich on the trade that flowed through the new waterway now discovered that their wealth made them targets for imperial requisition. The revolts began small, as such things always do, with individual acts of resistance that seemed insignificant in the context of an empire that ruled hundreds of millions of people. A tax collector found dead beside a country road, his strongbox empty and his escorts scattered. A granary burned in the night, its contents turned to ash and smoke. A recruitment officer chased from a village by farmers armed with nothing more than bamboo spears and righteous anger. But small acts of resistance have a way of growing into larger ones, and larger ones have a way of becoming full-scale rebellions when the conditions are right. The empire that had seemed so unified under the first Sui emperor now began to fragment along the fault lines of regional loyalty and class resentment. The very success of the dynasty's early years had created expectations that could not be sustained, had raised hopes that now seemed like cruel jokes played by fate on people who had believed in the possibility of better times. Li Yuan, the Duke of Tang, watched the empire's decay from his stronghold in the northern mountains, his experienced eyes reading the signs of dynastic collapse with the skill of a physician diagnosing a terminal illness. He had served the Sui faithfully for years, had led armies in their service, had believed in the dynasty's promise of permanent stability and prosperity. But belief, like loyalty, has its limits, and those limits are reached when service becomes suicide and faithfulness becomes foolishness. The emperor's final journey down the Grand Canal was a voyage through an empire that no longer recognized his authority, a realm that had learned to associate his name with suffering rather than glory. The cities that had once sent delegations to greet the imperial barge now kept their gates closed and their militia ready. The countryside that had once bloomed with prosperity now showed the scars of rebellion and the harsh suppression that had followed. The assassination came at night, as such things usually do, in the private chambers of the palace where the emperor had gone to escape the increasingly desperate reports from his generals and governors. The assassin was one of his own generals, a man named Yuan Huaji, who had served the dynasty faithfully until faithfulness became impossible to distinguish from complicity in the empire's destruction. The blade entered between the ribs with the professional precision of a soldier who had learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. The emperor's final words were lost in the darkness of the palace chamber, carried away by the night wind that blew across the canal waters. The man who had dreamed of surpassing his father, of writing his name in immortal characters across the scroll of history, died in the same obscurity that claims most rulers when their time is done. The empire did not die with its emperor, but it was transformed beyond recognition, carved up among warlords and rebels who had learned that the mandate of heaven was not permanent, that dynasties could fall as quickly as they had risen, that the greatest achievements could become the heaviest burdens when they were built on foundations of human suffering. The Grand Canal survived, as great works of engineering often do, outlasting the dynasty that had built it and serving the empires that would follow. The waterway that had been carved with peasant blood and imperial ambition would carry the commerce of China for more than 1,000 years, would connect regions and cultures and peoples in ways that its creator had never imagined. But the cost had been enormous, measured not just in the lives of those who had died in its construction, but in the collapse of the dynasty that had demanded such sacrifice. The moon continued to shine on the canal waters, its light reflecting off the surface like silver coins scattered by a careless hand. The barges still moved through the night, but they now carried different passengers, served different masters, flew different flags. The empire that had seemed so permanent, so destined for eternal glory, had learned the lesson that all empires must eventually learn, that human ambition has limits, that even the greatest achievements can become the instruments of their creator's destruction, that the mandate of heaven is not a guarantee, but a responsibility that must be earned anew with each generation. The wind blew across the water, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of temple bells, the whisper of a world that had learned to live without the emperor who had dreamed of reshaping it according to his own vision. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of hammers and picks, the ghost of voices raised in labor and complaint, the memory of a man who had confused the ability to command with the wisdom to lead, who had believed that great works were more important than the great people who built them. Emperor HUIZONG of Song. The zither sang its silver song in the plum blossom courtyard, its strings trembling with melodies that seemed to capture the very essence of spring itself, while the petals fell like snow around the emperor who had learned to paint with the precision of the gods, but had forgotten how to rule with the wisdom of mortals. Emperor Huizong of Song sat cross-legged on a silk cushion, his brush poised above rice paper that gleamed like fresh snow, his eyes focused on the single bird that had alighted on a branch outside his window. This was the moment he lived for, the perfect convergence of artistic inspiration and technical mastery, when the boundary between observer and observed dissolved into something approaching transcendence. The painting that emerged from his brush was a masterpiece of subtle observation and technical perfection, each feather rendered with the kind of attention to detail that made the bird seem more real than reality itself. The emperor had studied the movement of wings for decades, had observed the way light fell across different types of plumage, had learned to capture not just the appearance of life, but its essential spirit. His paintings were treasured throughout the empire, collected by connoisseurs who understood that they were witnessing the work of the greatest artist ever to wear the dragon robes. But while Huizong painted his birds and composed his poetry, while he perfected his calligraphy and expanded his collection of ancient bronzes, the empire he had inherited was slowly dissolving around him like watercolors in rain. The Song dynasty had been built on the foundation of cultural refinement and technological innovation, had created a civilization that valued learning over warfare, art over conquest, the subtleties of philosophical discourse over the crude simplicities of military might. It was a beautiful experiment in the possibility of governing through moral example rather than brute force, but it was an experiment that required a world willing to be governed by such principles. The court that surrounded the emperor was a marvel of cultured sophistication, filled with scholars who could recite the classics from memory, poets who could compose verses that would make the ancient masters weep with envy, painters who could capture the essence of a landscape with a few precise strokes of the brush. The palace libraries contained more books than had ever been assembled in one place, while the workshops produced porcelain and silk that were prized from Japan to the markets of the distant West. This was civilization at its most refined, culture at its most elevated, human achievement at its most sublime. But refinement, as the emperor was about to learn, was not the same as strength, and cultural sophistication was not the same as military preparedness. To the north, beyond the Great Wall that had protected China for centuries, the Jin dynasty was rising like a storm cloud on the horizon, its armies hardened by generations of warfare, its leaders united by the simple desire to take what the Song had built and make it their own. The Jin were not barbarians in the crude sense of the word, but they were warriors in a way that the Song had forgotten how to be. They had learned to fight on horseback, to move with the speed of the wind across the steppes, to strike like lightning and vanish like smoke. Their society was organized around the principle that strength was the only virtue that mattered, that the strong had the right to rule the weak, that conquest was not just a political tool, but a moral imperative. The first attacks came like fingers of frost creeping across a window, small raids that tested the Song defenses and found them wanting. The border fortresses that had stood for generations fell one by one, their garrisons overwhelmed by enemies who fought with a ferocity that seemed to come from another age. The reports that reached the capital spoke of cities burned and populations scattered, of armies that melted away before the Jin cavalry like morning mist before the sun. Huizong's response to these disasters was to increase his patronage of the arts, to commission more paintings and poems, to surround himself with beauty that would somehow protect him from the ugly realities of warfare and defeat. The imperial workshops worked day and night to produce the porcelain and silk that the emperor believed would demonstrate the superiority of Song civilization, would show the Jin that culture was more valuable than conquest, that the ability to create beauty was more important than the ability to destroy it. The emperor's own artistic output reached new heights during these years of crisis, as if the approach of catastrophe had somehow refined his already extraordinary talents. He painted birds that seemed to breathe, landscapes that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of the silk on which they were painted, calligraphy that transformed simple characters into works of art that would be treasured for centuries. The court scholars spoke of a new golden age of Chinese culture, of an artistic renaissance that would eclipse even the achievements of the Tang dynasty. But while the emperor painted and the scholars wrote, while the court musicians composed new melodies and the palace gardens bloomed with flowers from every corner of the empire, the Jin armies continued their inexorable advance. The frozen rivers of the north became highways for their cavalry. The mountain passes became corridors for their supply trains. The very geography of China seemed to reshape itself to accommodate their conquest. The siege of Kaifeng began in the winter of 1126, when the Jin armies surrounded the Song capital like a noose slowly tightening around the neck of a condemned man. The city's walls were strong, its defenders numerous, its supplies adequate for a long siege. But the Jin had learned patience from their years of warfare, had discovered that time was often more powerful than catapults, that hunger was more effective than arrows, that the will to resist could be eroded as surely as walls could be breached. The emperor continued his artistic pursuits even as the siege lines tightened, even as the sounds of battle grew closer to the palace walls. He painted winter scenes that captured the beauty of snow-covered landscapes, composed poems about the transience of earthly power, practiced calligraphy that seemed to become more perfect as the world around him became more chaotic. It was as if he had retreated into art as a form of spiritual refuge, had chosen to inhabit a realm where beauty was eternal and truth was absolute. The end came not with a dramatic assault but with the quiet opening of gates that could no longer be defended, the resigned surrender of a city that had exhausted its capacity for resistance. The Jin soldiers entered Kaifeng like water flowing into a broken vessel, their presence transforming the capital from a center of Song civilization into a trophy of Jin conquest. The libraries were looted, the workshops were closed, the scholars were scattered like leaves before an autumn wind. The Jinkang incident, as historians would later call it, was remarkable not for its violence but for its thoroughness. The Jin did not simply conquer the Song. They captured the entire imperial family, the complete apparatus of government, the accumulated treasures of a dynasty that had ruled for over a century. The emperor, who had spent his life creating beauty, found himself a prisoner of men who valued only utility, who saw his paintings as curiosities and his poetry as evidence of weakness. The journey north to the Jin capital was a long humiliation, a slow procession of captives who had once believed that civilization was stronger than barbarism, that culture was more durable than conquest. The emperor traveled in a simple cart, his dragon robes replaced by the plain clothing of a prisoner, his brushes and paints confiscated by guards who could not distinguish between priceless art and worthless scribbles. But even in captivity, even stripped of his throne and his treasures, HUIZONG continued to paint. The Jin allowed him this simple pleasure, perhaps out of curiosity about the strange emperor who seemed to care more about birds than about battles, who could create beauty even in the most desperate circumstances. The paintings from this period were different from his earlier work, marked by a quality of melancholy that had been absent from his imperial productions, a recognition of transience that made them more rather than less beautiful. The final painting was completed by lamplight in a simple room in the Jin capital, far from the plum blossom courtyard where the emperor had once sat, surrounded by the splendor of his court. It showed a single bird perched on a bare branch, its feathers ruffled by an invisible wind, its eyes looking towards something beyond the boundaries of the silk. The brushwork was as perfect as ever, the composition as balanced, but there was something in the bird's posture that spoke of exile and loss, of dreams that had been beautiful, but had proven inadequate to the demands of the world. The emperor died quietly, as failed rulers often do, attended by a few servants who remembered his kindness and his talent, mourned by scholars who understood that they had witnessed the end of an age. The Jin allowed him a simple funeral, a brief ceremony that acknowledged his former rank, while making clear that his time had passed. The man who had been the greatest artist ever to wear the dragon robes was buried in foreign soil, far from the empire he had loved more in theory than in practice. The Song dynasty survived in the south, reconstituted itself as the Southern Song, continued to produce art and literature and philosophy for another century and a half. But something essential had been lost in the Jinkang incident, some confidence in the power of culture to protect itself, some belief that beauty was its own justification. The empire that emerged from the catastrophe was different, more practical, more aware of the need to balance artistic achievement with military preparedness. The paintings that Huizong had created during his captivity were eventually returned to China, treasured by collectors who understood that they represented not just artistic achievement, but historical testimony. The emperor who had failed to defend his empire had succeeded in creating a body of work that would outlast any dynasty, that would speak to future generations about the eternal human desire to create beauty in the face of destruction, to find meaning in the midst of chaos, to transform suffering into art. The plum trees continued to bloom in the courtyards of the abandoned palaces, their petals falling like snow on empty stones, their beauty undiminished by the absence of imperial observers. The zithers fell silent, their strings broken, their music existing now only in the memory of those who had heard it. But the paintings remained, and with them the record of a man who had learned that the greatest art is often born from the deepest loss, that the most beautiful creations can emerge from the most desperate circumstances, that the ability to see beauty in the world is itself a form of victory that no conquest can erase. The wind blew through the empty courtyards, carrying with it the scent of blossoms and the memory of melodies, the whisper of a civilization that had chosen beauty over power and had paid the price for that choice. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of brush strokes on silk, the ghost of poems that had captured the essence of moments that would never come again, the memory of an emperor who had painted birds so real they seemed to fly, but who had forgotten that even the most beautiful cages cannot protect their inhabitants from the storms that rage beyond their walls. Montezuma too. The twilight settled over Tenochtitlan like a velvet cloth embroidered with stars, the great city floating on its island in Lake Texcoco, like a dream of architectural perfection made manifest in stone and water. The evening breeze carried the scent of copal incense from 1,000 temples, mixing with the fragrance of flowers that bloomed in gardens that had been carved from the very surface of the lake. The canals reflected the last light of day, their waters rippling gently as canoes glided between the floating gardens where maize and beans grew in carefully tended rows that seemed to stretch toward the distant mountains. Montezuma too stood on the highest terrace of his palace, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon, feeling the weight of 5 centuries of Aztec achievement pressing down upon his shoulders like a feathered cloak made of history itself. The empire he had inherited was the greatest that had ever existed in the Americas, stretching from the deserts of the north to the jungles of the south, from the shores of the eastern sea to the mountains of the west. Tribute flowed into Tenochtitlan like rivers converging on a great lake, carrying with it the wealth of 100 subject peoples and the acknowledgement of Aztec supremacy. The city itself was a marvel that had impressed even the most sophisticated visitors from the Old World, though few of them had been able to appreciate the subtlety of its engineering or the complexity of its social organization. The causeways that connected the island to the mainland were broad enough for 10 men to walk abreast, raised above the water on foundations that had been sunk deep into the lake bed. The aqueducts that brought fresh water from the distant springs were marvels of hydraulic engineering that would have challenged the best Roman architects. The markets were filled with goods from every corner of the empire, while the schools taught the children of nobles to read the complex hieroglyphs that recorded the history of their people. But even in this paradise of imperial achievement, even surrounded by the evidence of Aztec superiority, Montezuma felt the weight of unease settling in his heart, like a stone dropping into still water. The omens had been growing stronger for months, signs and portents that spoke of change coming from the east, of visitors who would bring with them the end of the world as the Aztec people had known it. The comet had appeared first, a star with a tail that blazed across the night sky, like a wound in the heavens themselves. The priests had consulted their ancient books, had offered sacrifices to the gods who controlled the movement of celestial bodies, had spoken in whispers about the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who had once ruled the earth and who had promised to return in the year AKKAD, the year one reed, which was now approaching with the inexorable certainty of fate itself. The weeping statue in the temple of Huitzilopochtli had been the next sign, the carved image of the war god shedding tears that seemed to flow from stone eyes, as if the very gods were mourning for something that had not yet come to pass. The priests had found no explanation for the phenomenon, no precedent in their vast libraries of ritual knowledge, no way to interpret tears from a god who had never been known to show mercy or sorrow. But the most disturbing omen of all had been the bird that had been brought to the emperor by fishermen who had found it floating on the lake, its feathers the color of ash, its eyes reflecting images that seemed to come from another world. When Montezuma had looked into those eyes, he had seen men riding on the backs of deer, men with pale skin and hair like dried grass, men who carried in their hands the lightning of the gods themselves. The vision had lasted only moments, but it had been enough to fill the emperor with a dread that no amount of ritual purification could dispel. The reports from the eastern coast had begun to arrive shortly after the vision, carried by runners who had traveled day and night to bring news of the strangers who had appeared on the horizon in floating houses that moved without paddles or poles. The descriptions were so strange, so impossible, that Montezuma had at first dismissed them as the fantasies of men who had been too long in the sun. But the reports kept coming, each one more detailed than the last, each one confirming that something unprecedented was happening in the world beyond the mountains. The strangers were men, but they were unlike any men the Aztec scouts had ever seen. Their skin was pale as the belly of a fish, their hair grew in colors that no human hair should possess, and they wore clothing that seemed to be made of metal that gleamed like water in the sunlight. They rode on the backs of animals that were larger than deer but different from any creature that existed in the Aztec world, beasts that seemed to be part of their riders, as if men and animals had been joined together by some incomprehensible magic. But most disturbing of all, the strangers possessed weapons that commanded the thunder and the lightning, that could kill at a distance greater than any arrow could fly, that made sounds like the voice of angry gods. The few warriors who had been brave enough to approach them had been struck down by invisible forces, their bodies torn apart by powers that no human should have been able to command. The emperor's response to these reports was to increase his devotions to the gods, to offer more sacrifices, to perform more rituals, to seek guidance from the divine powers that had protected the Aztec people for centuries. But the gods seemed distant now, their voices muffled by the sound of approaching thunder, their presence dimmed by the shadow of changes that were beyond even their power to control. The decision to receive the strangers as honored guests was made with the kind of desperate hope that comes to men who are drowning and will grasp at any offered hand, even if it belongs to the person who pushed them into the water. If these pale men were indeed the servants of Quetzalcoatl, if they had come to fulfill the ancient prophecies, then resistance would be not just futile but impious. The emperor, who had spent his life serving the gods, could not risk offending them by refusing to honor their emissaries. The preparations for the strangers' arrival were magnificent, a display of imperial hospitality that was intended to demonstrate both the wealth of the Aztec Empire and the proper respect that should be shown to visitors who might be divine. The causeway was decorated with flowers and feathers, the canals were filled with canoes carrying musicians and dancers, and the palace was prepared to receive guests who would be treated with the kind of reverence normally reserved for the gods themselves. Hernán Cortés entered Tenochtitlan like a conqueror masquerading as a diplomat, his steel armor gleaming in the sunlight, his horse's hooves ringing on the stones of the causeway like the sound of destiny itself. The Spanish captain was a man who had learned to read the signs of weakness in his enemies, who understood that confidence was often more important than strength, who had discovered that the greatest conquests were often achieved not through violence, but through the patient exploitation of his opponent's own beliefs and fears. The meeting between emperor and conquistador was a study in misunderstanding, a collision between two worlds that had developed in complete isolation from each other and now found themselves forced to interact according to rules that neither fully comprehended. Montezuma approached the encounter with the reverence of a man greeting a god, while Cortés approached it with the calculation of a man evaluating a potential victim. The gifts that the emperor presented to his guests were treasures that would have made European princes weep with envy. Feathered cloaks that had taken master craftsmen years to create, jewelry worked in gold and jade, weapons inlaid with obsidian that could cut through Spanish steel. But the Spaniards saw only the raw materials, the gold that could be melted down and shipped to Spain, the wealth that could finance further conquests and make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. The hospitality that Montezuma offered was genuine, the product of a culture that had learned to value courtesy and proper behavior, that believed in the importance of treating guests with respect and generosity. The emperor opened his palace to the strangers, provided them with the finest food and drink, entertained them with music and dance, shared with them the accumulated wisdom of Aztec civilization. But hospitality, as he was about to learn, could be mistaken for weakness, and generosity could be interpreted as an invitation to take more than was freely offered. The transformation of guests into captors happened gradually, like the slow tightening of a noose around the neck of a condemned man. The Spaniards, who had been welcomed as honored visitors, began to behave like occupying forces, demanding tribute, interfering with religious ceremonies, treating the Aztec nobles with the kind of casual contempt that revealed their true opinion of the civilization they had encountered. The emperor found himself a prisoner in his own palace, surrounded by men who smiled when they spoke to him, but whose eyes held the cold calculation of predators evaluating their prey. The gold that had been offered as gifts was now demanded as tribute. The courtesy that had been extended as hospitality was now expected as submission. And the respect that had been given to supposed gods was now revealed as the deference of the conquered to their conquerors. The uprising that followed was inevitable, the explosion of rage that comes when a proud people discover that they have been deceived and humiliated by those they had trusted. The Aztec warriors who had been held in check by their emperor's commands now poured into the streets of Tenochtitlan like water bursting through a broken dam, their obsidian-tipped spears glinting in the sunlight, their war cries echoing from the walls of the floating city. The battle that followed was unlike anything that had been seen in the Americas, a clash between two completely different ways of war, two incompatible views of honor and courage, two civilizations that had been destined to collide from the moment the first Spanish ship had appeared on the eastern horizon. The Aztec warriors fought with the fury of men defending their homes and their gods, while the Spanish soldiers fought with the desperation of men who were vastly outnumbered and thousands of miles from any possible reinforcement. The Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, saw the Spanish attempt to flee the city under cover of darkness, their retreat turning into a rout as the Aztec warriors attacked from canoes and rooftops, their arrows and spears finding targets in the confusion of men and horses, struggling to cross the causeway in the darkness. The lake itself seemed to turn against the invaders, its waters red with blood, its surface littered with the bodies of men who had dreamed of gold and had found only death. But the victory was temporary, the brief triumph of a civilization that had learned too late that some enemies cannot be defeated by traditional means, that some invasions cannot be repelled by courage alone. The Spanish returned with reinforcements, with allies recruited from among the Aztecs' enemies, with diseases that killed more efficiently than any weapon, with a determination that was hardened by the memory of defeat and the promise of revenge. The siege of Tenochtitlan that followed was a slow strangulation, a gradual destruction of a city that had been built over centuries and was now being torn apart stone by stone. The causeways were cut, the aqueducts were destroyed, the canals were filled with rubble, and the floating gardens were burned until the great lake itself seemed to weep for the civilization that was dying in its waters. Montezuma's death came quietly, almost anticlimactically, the end of a man who had been caught between two worlds and had found himself adequate to neither. Whether he died from stones thrown by his own people or from Spanish steel mattered less than the fact that he had lived to see the end of everything he had been raised to protect, had witnessed the destruction of a civilization that had taken centuries to build and had been destroyed in a matter of months. The city fell not with a single dramatic assault, but with the slow collapse of a structure that had been undermined from within, its foundations weakened by disease and despair, its walls breached by enemies who had learned to use the Aztecs' own beliefs against them. The great pyramids were torn down, the temples were destroyed, the books were burned, and the floating gardens were abandoned to the reeds and the water birds. But even in destruction, even in the face of total defeat, something of the Aztec spirit survived. The chinampas, those floating gardens that had fed the great city, continued to exist in the quieter corners of the lake, tended by farmers who remembered the old ways and preserved them in the face of Spanish disapproval. The language survived, the stories survived, the memory of what had been lost survived to inspire future generations who would struggle to understand how a civilization so advanced could have been destroyed so completely. The dawn came slowly over the ruins of Tenochtitlan, its light revealing the extent of the destruction that had been wrought in the name of conquest and conversion. The great lake still reflected the sky, but it was a different sky now, one that had been forever changed by the collision of two worlds, by the meeting of two civilizations that had been destined to destroy each other from the moment they had first encountered each other across the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. The wind blew across the water, carrying with it the scent of flowers and the memory of incense, the whisper of a civilization that had learned to build beauty on the surface of a lake, but had not learned to defend it against enemies who came from beyond the horizon. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could hear the echo of temple bells and the ghost of drums, the memory of an emperor who had mistaken courtesy for strength, who had believed that the gods would protect those who served them faithfully, who had learned too late that some changes are too powerful for any individual to resist and too fundamental for any civilization to survive. Atahualpa, the cool mountain air of Cajamarca, carried the scent of eucalyptus and the distant sound of llamas calling to each other across the high plateaus, while the campfires of the Inca army twinkled like earthbound stars in the gathering dusk of the Andes. Atahualpa sat on his golden throne, wrapped in a cloak woven from the finest vicuña wool, watching the smoke from 10,000 fires rise toward the star-filled sky that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires since the world was young. The Sapa Inca, the son of the sun, the living god who ruled the greatest empire the Americas had ever known, felt the weight of divinity pressing down upon his shoulders like a mantle made of the very mountains themselves. The empire that stretched around him was a marvel of human organization, a realm that extended from the deserts of the north to the forests of the south, from the shores of the western sea to the edge of the eastern jungles. The roads that connected this vast territory were engineering marvels that would have impressed Roman builders, straight lines carved into the faces of cliffs, bridges woven from living vines that could support the weight of armies, way stations that provided shelter and supplies for the chasqui runners, who carried messages at speeds that would not be matched until the invention of the telegraph. But the empire that Atahualpa had inherited was wounded, weakened by the civil war that had torn it apart like a condor fighting with its own shadow. The conflict with his half-brother Huascar had been more than a simple struggle for succession. It had been a war between two visions of what the Inca Empire should become, two different understandings of the relationship between the divine ruler and his subjects. two incompatible dreams of imperial destiny. Huasca had represented the old ways, the traditional approach to Inca rule that emphasized the sacred nature of the emperor's authority and the importance of maintaining the ancient customs that had made the empire great. His supporters had been drawn primarily from the nobility of Cusco, the sacred city that was the heart of the Inca world, men who traced their lineage back to the first Inca and who believed that change was a form of sacrilege. Atahualpa, by contrast, had been the candidate of innovation, the leader who promised to adapt the empire to the changing realities of the world, who understood that even the most sacred traditions might need to be modified if they were to survive the challenges of the future. His army had been composed largely of warriors from the northern provinces, men who had been conquered by the Inca, but who had been integrated into the empire, and who now served with a loyalty that had been earned rather than inherited. The victory at the Battle of Quipaipan had been decisive, the kind of crushing defeat that ends civil wars and establishes the legitimacy of the winner beyond all question. Huasca's army had been scattered like leaves before the wind, his generals had been captured or killed, and the pretender himself had been taken prisoner and would spend the rest of his brief life in chains. The empire was united again under a single ruler, but it was a unity that had been purchased with the blood of brothers and the destruction of cities that had stood for centuries. The reports from the coast had begun to arrive shortly after the civil war had ended, carried by runners who had traveled for days through the mountain passes to bring news of the strangers who had appeared on the horizon in floating houses that moved without paddles or sails. The descriptions were so strange, so impossible, that Atahualpa had at first dismissed them as the fantasies of men who had been too long in the sun or who had been influenced by the fermented beverages that were consumed during religious festivals. But the reports kept coming, each one more detailed than the last, each one confirming that something unprecedented was happening in the world beyond the mountains. The strangers were men, but they were unlike any men the Inca scouts had ever seen. Their skin was pale as the snow that crowned the highest peaks. Their hair grew in colors that no human hair should possess, and they wore clothing that seemed to be made of metal that gleamed like water in the sunlight. Most disturbing of all, the strangers possessed weapons that commanded the thunder and the lightning, that could kill at a distance greater than any slingstone could fly, that made sounds like the voice of angry gods. The few warriors who had been brave enough to approach them had been struck down by invisible forces, their bodies torn apart by powers that no human should have been able to command. The emperor's response to these reports was measured and careful, the reaction of a man who had learned through bitter experience that hasty decisions could have consequences that lasted for generations. If these pale men were indeed messengers from the gods, if they possessed powers that were beyond human understanding, then they deserved to be treated with the respect that should be shown to supernatural beings. But if they were merely unusual humans, if their strange appearance and mysterious weapons were simply the products of unfamiliar technologies, then they could be dealt with according to the normal protocols of diplomacy and warfare. The decision to meet the strangers at Cajamarca was made with the kind of calculated confidence that comes to rulers who have never known defeat, who have been raised to believe that their authority is absolute and their power is divine. The Inca army that assembled on the plateau was a force that had never been defeated in battle, a disciplined host of warriors who had conquered an empire and who were prepared to defend it against any threat, no matter how strange or unexpected. The plaza at Cajamarca was prepared for a ceremony that would demonstrate the power and majesty of the Inca Empire, a display of imperial splendor that would impress the strangers and establish the proper relationship between the son of the sun and whatever gods or spirits they might represent. The golden throne was placed in the center of the square, surrounded by the nobles of the empire in their finest clothes, while the army waited in perfect formation on the surrounding hills. Francisco Pizarro entered the plaza like a predator entering a trap that had been set for his prey, his steel armor gleaming in the afternoon sun, his sword hanging at his side like a promise of violence to come. The Spanish captain was a man who had learned to read the signs of weakness in his enemies, who understood that confidence was often more important than numbers, who had discovered that the greatest conquests were often achieved not through open warfare, but through the patient exploitation of his opponent's own beliefs and assumptions. The meeting between emperor and conquistador was a study in misunderstanding, a collision between two worlds that had developed in complete isolation from each other, and now found themselves forced to interact according to rules that neither fully comprehended. Atahualpa approached the encounter with the dignity of a god receiving homage from mortals, while Pizarro approached it with the calculation of a man who had already decided that his hosts were going to die. The Spanish chaplain who offered the emperor a Bible was performing a ritual that had been repeated countless times throughout the Americas, a ceremonial gesture that was intended to provide legal justification for what was about to happen. The book was meaningless to Atahualpa, a collection of marks on paper that had no relationship to the quipu system of knotted strings that the Inca used to record information. When he threw it to the ground, he was not rejecting Christianity, but simply disposing of an incomprehensible object that had been pressed into his hands by strangers whose intentions he did not understand. The signal for the attack came with the sound of a cannon firing, a thunderclap that echoed from the surrounding mountains like the voice of angry gods. The Spanish soldiers who had been hidden in the buildings around the plaza emerged with their weapons ready, their steel swords gleaming in the sunlight, their faces showing the kind of professional concentration that comes to men who have learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. The massacre that followed was swift and terrible, a demonstration of the difference between Bronze Age weapons and steel, between courage and technology, between the tactics of ceremonial warfare and the brutal efficiency of men who had learned to fight for survival. The Inca nobles who had come to witness a diplomatic ceremony found themselves trapped in a killing ground, their ceremonial weapons useless against Spanish steel, their elaborate costumes providing no protection against bullets and crossbow bolts. The capture of Atahualpa was almost anticlimactic, the seizure of a man who had been so confident in his own divinity that he had never imagined that mortals would dare to lay hands on him. The son of the sun, the living god who had ruled the greatest empire in the Americas, found himself a prisoner of men who saw him not as a deity but as a source of gold, not as a sacred ruler, but as a bargaining chip in a game whose rules he did not understand. The ransom that was demanded was impossible by any reasonable standard. A room filled with gold to the height of a man's outstretched arm, a quantity of precious metal that would have bankrupted most European kingdoms. But the Inca Empire was not most kingdoms, and the wealth that had been accumulated over centuries of conquest and tribute was beyond the imagination of men who had grown up in the poverty of 16th century Spain. The gold began to arrive within days, carried by llama trains that descended from the mountains like streams of liquid metal, each animal bearing ingots and ornaments that represented the artistic achievement of generations of Inca craftsmen. The ransom chamber filled slowly but steadily, the precious metal piling up like grain in a storehouse, each addition bringing the emperor closer to the freedom that had been promised by his captors. But the Spanish had never intended to honor their agreement, had never planned to release a prisoner whose continued existence would pose a threat to their control of the empire they had just conquered. The gold was valuable, but it was not as valuable as the security that would come from eliminating the last legitimate ruler of the Inca people, from ensuring that no native leader could rally resistance against Spanish rule. The trial that preceded Atahualpa's execution was a mockery of justice, a legal proceeding that had been designed to provide a veneer of legitimacy to what was essentially a political assassination. The charges were incomprehensible to a man who had been raised to believe that the emperor's will was the law, that the son of the sun could not commit crimes because he was the source of all authority. That resistance to Spanish rule was not rebellion, but the natural response of a ruler defending his people.